Sound Editions presents Iron John, a book about men, by Robert Bly. Read for you by the author.
Iron John, a book about men. We are living at an important and fruitful moment now, for it is clear to men that the images of adult manhood given by the popular culture are worn out. A man can no longer depend on them. By the time a man is 35, he knows that the images of the right man, the tough man, the true man, which he received in high school, do not work in life. Such a man is open to visions of what a man is or could be. The hearth and fairy stories have passed as water through 50 feet of soil, through generations of men and women, and we can trust their images more than, say, those invented by Hans Christian Andersen. The images the old stories give, stealing the key from under the mother's pillow, picking up a golden feather fallen from the burning breast of the firebird, finding the wild man under the lake water, following the tracks of one's own wound through the forest and finding that it resembles the tracks of a god. These are meant to be taken slowly into the body. They continue to unfold once taken in. It is in the old myths that we hear, for example, of Zeus energy, that positive leadership energy in men, which popular culture constantly declares does not exist. From King Arthur, we learn the value of the male mentor in the lives of young men. We hear from the Iron John story the importance of moving from the mother's realm to the father's realm. And from all initiation stories, we learn how essential it is to leave our parental expectations entirely and find a second father or a second king. There is male initiation, female initiation, and human initiation. In the following text, I will be talking about male initiation only. I want to make clear that this work does not seek to turn men against women, nor to return men to the domineering mode that has led to repression of women and their values for centuries. The thought in this work does not constitute a challenge to the women's movement. The two movements are related to each other, but each moves on a separate timetable. The grief in men has been increasing steadily since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the grief has reached a depth now that cannot be ignored. The dark side of men is clear. Their mad exploitation of earth resources, devaluation and humiliation of women, obsession with tribal warfare are undeniable. Genetic inheritance contributes to their obsessions, but also culture and environment. We have defective mythologies that ignore masculine depth of feeling, assign men a place in the sky instead of earth, teach obedience to the wrong powers, work to keep men boys, and entangle both men and women in systems of industrial domination that exclude both matriarchy and patriarchy. I speak of the wild man on this tape, and the distinction between the savage man and the wild man is crucial throughout. The savage mode does great damage to soul, earth, and humankind. We can say that though the savage is wounded, he prefers not to examine it. The wild man who has examined his wound resembles a Zen priest or a shaman or a woodsman more than a savage. The knowledge of how to build a nest in a bare tree, how to fly to the wintering place, how to perform the mating dance, all of this information is stored in a bird in the reservoirs of its instinctual brain. But human beings, sensing how much flexibility they might need in meeting new situations, decided to store this sort of knowledge outside the instinctual systems. And they stored it in fairy stories. Stories, then, fairy stories, legends, myths, hearth stories amount to a reservoir where we keep new ways of responding that we can adopt when the conventional and current ways wear out. And we talk a great deal about the American man, as if there were some constant quality that remains stable over decades or even within a single decade. The men who live today have veered far away from the Saturnian, old man-minded farmer, proud of his introversion, who arrived in New England in 1630, willing to sit through 3 services in an unheated church. In the South, an expansive, mother-bound cavalier developed, and neither of these two American men resembled the greedy railroad entrepreneur that later developed in the Northeast, nor the reckless I-will-do-without-culture settlers of the West. Even in our own era, the agreed-on model has changed dramatically. During the 50s, for an example, an American character appeared with some consistency that became a model of manhood adopted by many men, namely the 50s male. He got to work early, labored responsibly, supported his wife and children, and admired discipline. Reagan is a sort of mummified version of this dogged type. This sort of man didn't see women's souls well, but he appreciated their bodies, and his view of culture and America's part in it was boyish and optimistic. Many of his qualities were strong and positive, but underneath the charm and bluff there was, and still remains, much isolation, deprivation, and passivity. Unless he has an enemy, he isn't sure that he's alive. During the 60s, another sort of man appeared. The waste and violence of the Vietnam War made men question whether they knew what an adult male really was. If manhood meant Vietnam, did they want any part of it? Meanwhile, the feminist movement encouraged men to actually look at women, forcing them to become conscious of concerns and sufferings that the 50s male labored to avoid. As men began to examine women's history and women's sensibilities, some men began to notice what was called their feminine side, and to pay attention to it. This process continues to this day, and I would say that most contemporary men are involved in it in some way. There's something wonderful about this development. I mean, the practice of men welcoming their own feminine consciousness and nurturing it. This is important, and yet I have the sense that there is something wrong. The male in the past 20 years has become more thoughtful and more gentle, but by this process he has not become more free. In the 70s, I began to see all over the country a phenomenon that we might call the soft male. Sometimes even today, when I look out at an audience, perhaps half the young males are what I'd call soft. They're lovely, valuable people. I like them. They're not interested in harming the earth or starting wars. There's a gentle attitude toward life in their whole being and style of living. But many of these men are not happy. You quickly notice the lack of energy in them. They are life-preserving, but not exactly life-giving. Ironically, you often see these men with strong women who positively radiate energy. I first learned about the anguish of so-called soft men when they told their stories in early men's gatherings. In 1980, the Lama community in New Mexico asked me to teach a conference for men only, their first, in which about 40 men participated. Each day we concentrated on one Greek god and one old story, and then late in the afternoons we gathered to talk. When the younger men spoke, it was not uncommon for them to be weeping within 5 minutes. The amount of grief and anguish in these younger men was astounding to me. Part of their grief rose out of remoteness from their fathers, which they felt keenly, but partly, too, grief flowed from trouble in their marriages or relationships. They had learned to be receptive, but receptivity wasn't enough to carry their marriages through troubled times. In every relationship, something fierce is needed once in a while. Both the man and the woman need to have it. But at the point when it was needed, often the young man came up short. He was nurturing, but something else was required for his relationship and for his life. The journey many American men have taken into softness or receptivity or, quote, development of the feminine side, unquote, has been an immensely valuable journey, but more travel lies ahead. No stage is the final stop. One of the fairy tales that speak of a third possibility for men, a third mode, is a story called Iron John or Iron Hans. Though it was first set down by the Grimm brothers around 1820, this story could be 10 or 20,000 years old. As the story starts, we find that something strange has been happening in a remote area of the forest near the king's castle. When hunters go into this area, they disappear and never come back. 20 others go after the first group and do not come back. In time, people begin to get the feeling that there's something weird in that part of the forest and, quote, they don't go there anymore, unquote. One day, an unknown hunter shows up at the castle and says, what can I do? Anything dangerous to do around here? The king says, well, I could mention the forest, but there's a problem. The people who go there don't come back. The return rate is not good. Oh, that's just the sort of thing I like, the young man says. So he goes into the forest, and interestingly, he goes there alone, taking only his dog. The young man and his dog wander about in the forest, and they go past a pond. Suddenly, a hand reaches up from the water, grabs the dog, and pulls it down. The young man doesn't respond by becoming hysterical. He merely says, this must be the place. Fond as he is of his dog, and reluctant as he is to abandon him, the hunter goes back to the castle, rounds up 3 more men with buckets, and then comes back to the pond to bucket out the water. Anyone who's ever tried it will quickly note that such bucketing is very slow work. In time, what they find lying in the bottom of the pond is a large man covered with hair from head to foot. The hair is reddish. It looks a little like rusty iron. They take the man back to the castle and imprison him. The king puts him in an iron cage in the courtyard, calls him Iron John, and gives the key into the keeping of the queen. Let's stop the story here for a second. When a contemporary man looks down into his psyche, he may, if conditions are right, find under the water of his soul, lying in an area no one has visited for a long time, an ancient hairy man. The mythological systems associate hair with the instinctive and the sexual and the primitive. What I'm suggesting, then, is that every modern male has, lying at the bottom of his psyche, a large, primitive being covered with hair down to his feet. Making contact with this wild man is the step the 80s male or the 90s male has yet to take. That bucketing out process has yet to begin in our contemporary culture. As the story suggests very delicately, there's more than a little fear around this hairy man, as there is around all change. When a man begins to develop the receptive side of himself and gets over his initial skittishness, he usually finds the experience to be wonderful. He gets to write poetry and go out and sit by the ocean. He doesn't have to be on top in sex anymore. He becomes empathetic. It's a new, humming, surprising world. But going down through water to touch the wild man at the bottom of the pond is quite a different matter. The being who stands up is frightening, and seems even more so now when the corporations do so much work to produce the sanitized, hairless, shallow man. When a man welcomes his responsiveness, or what we sometimes call his internal woman, he often feels warmer, more companionable, more alive. But when he approaches what I'll call the quotation mark deep male, unquote, he feels risk. Welcoming the hairy man is scary and risky, and it requires a different kind of courage. Contact with Iron John requires a willingness to descend into the male psyche and accept what's down there, including the nourishing dark. Now back to the story. One day the king's 8-year-old son is playing in the courtyard with the golden ball that he loves, and it rolls into the wild man's cage. If the young boy wants the ball back, he's going to have to approach the hairy man and ask for it. But this is going to be a problem. The golden ball reminds us of that unity of personality we had as children, a kind of radiance or wholeness, before we split into male and female, rich and poor, bad and good. The ball is golden as the sun is, and round. Like the sun, it gives off a radiant energy from the inside. We notice that the boy is 8. All of us, whether boys or girls, lose something around the age of 8. If we still have the golden ball in kindergarten, we lose it in grade school. Whatever is still left, we lose in high school. Whether we are male or female, once the golden ball is gone, we spend the rest of our lives trying to get it back. The Iron John story proposes that the golden ball lies within the magnetic field of the wild man, which is a very hard concept for us to grasp. We have to accept the possibility that the true radiant energy in the male does not hide in, reside in, or wait for us in the feminine realm, nor in the macho John Wayne realm, but in the magnetic field of the deep masculine. It is protected by the instinctive one, who's underwater and who has been there we don't know how long. Most men want some nice person to bring the ball back, but the story hints that we won't find the golden ball in the force field of an Asian guru, or even the force field of a gentle Jesus. Our story is not anti-Christian, but pre-Christian by 1,000 years or so, and its message is still true. Getting the golden ball back is incompatible with certain kinds of conventional tameness and niceness. The first step amounts to approaching the cage and asking for the golden ball back. Some men are ready to take that step, while others haven't yet bucketed the water out of the pond. They haven't left the collective male identity and gone out into the unknown area alone, or gone only with their dog. The story says that after the dog, in quotes, goes down, unquote, one has to start to work with buckets. No giant is going to come along and suck all the water out for you. That magic stuff is not going to help. And a weekend at Esalen won't do it. Acid or cocaine won't do it. The man has to do it bucket by bucket. This resembles the slow discipline of art. It's the work that Rembrandt did, that Picasso and Yeats and Rilke and Bach did. Bucket work implies much more discipline than most men realize. Jung remarked that all successful requests to the psyche involve deals. The psyche likes to make deals. If a part of you, for example, is immensely lazy and doesn't want to do any work, a flat-out New Year's resolution won't do any good. The whole thing will go better if you say to your lazy part, "You let me work for an hour, and then I'll let you be a slob for an hour. Is that a deal?" So, in Iron John, a deal is made. The wild man agrees to give the golden ball back if the boy opens the cage. The boy, apparently frightened, runs off. He doesn't even answer. Isn't that what happens? We have been told so often by parents, ministers, grade school teachers, high school principals that we should have nothing to do with the wild man, that when he says, "I'll return the ball if you let me out of the cage," we don't even reply. Maybe 10 years pass now. On the second day, the man could be 25. He goes back to the wild man and says, "Could I have my ball back?" The wild man says, "Yes, if you let me out of the cage." Actually, just returning to the wild man a second time is a marvelous thing. Some men never come back at all. The 25-year-old man hears the sentence all right, but by now he has 2 Toyotas and a mortgage, maybe a wife and a child. How can he let the wild man out of the cage? The man usually walks away the second time also, without saying a word. Now 10 more years pass. Let's say the man is now 35. Have you ever seen the look of dismay on the face of a 35-year-old man? Feeling overworked, alienated, empty, he asked the wild man with full heart this time, "Could I have my golden ball back?" Yes, the wild man says, "If you let me out of my cage." Now something marvelous happens in the story. The boy speaks to the wild man and continues the conversation. He says, "Even if I wanted to let you out, I couldn't because I don't know where the key is." That's so good. By the time we are 35, we don't know where the key is. It isn't exactly that we've forgotten. We never knew where it was in the first place. The story says that when the king locked up the wild man, he gave the key into the keeping of the queen. But we were only about 7 then. And in any case, our father never told us what he had done with it. So, where is the key? The wild man replies, "The key is under your mother's pillow." Getting the key back from under the mother's pillow is a troublesome task. Freud, taking advice from a Greek play, says that a man should not skip over the mutual attraction between himself and his mother if he wants a long life. The mother's pillow, after all, lies near where she makes love to your father. Moreover, there's another implication attached to the pillow. Michael Meade, the storyteller, once remarked to me that the pillow is also the place where the mother stores all her expectations of you. She dreams, "My son the doctor, my son the Jungian analyst, my son the Wall Street genius," but very few mothers dream, "My son the wild man." Attacking the mother, confronting her, shouting at her, which some Freudians are prone to urge us on, probably does not accomplish much. She may just smile and talk to you with her elbow on the pillow. So the key has to be stolen. I recall talking to an audience of men and women once about this problem of stealing the key. A young man, obviously well trained in New Age modes of operation, said, "Robert, I'm disturbed by this idea of stealing the key. Stealing isn't right. Couldn't a group of us just go to the mother and say, 'Mom, could I have the key back?'" His model was probably consensus work, the way the staff at the health food store settles things. I felt the souls of all the women in the room rise up in the air to kill him. Men like that are as dangerous to women as they are to men. No mother worth her salt would give the key away anyway. If the son can't steal it, he doesn't deserve it. Mothers are intuitively aware of what happens if he got the key. They would lose their boys. The possessiveness that mothers typically exercise on sons, not to mention the possessiveness that fathers typically exercise on daughters, can never be underestimated. We could spend days talking about how to steal the key in a practical way. The story itself leaves everything open and simply says, one day he stole the key, brought it to the wild man's cage, and opened the lock. As he did so, he pinched one of his fingers. That detail will become important in the next part of this story. The wild man is then free at last, and it's clear that he will go back to his own forest, far from the castle. The boy in our story, or the 35-year-old man in our mind, however you want to look at it, now does something marvelous. He speaks to the wild man once more and says, "Wait a minute! If my parents come home and find you gone, they will beat me." That sentence makes the heart sink, particularly if we know something about child-rearing practices that have prevailed for a long time in Northern Europe. As Alice Miller reminds us in her book, For Your Own Good, child psychologists in 19th century Germany warned parents especially about exuberance. Exuberance in a child is bad, and at the first sign of it, parents should be severe. Exuberance implies that the wild man or girl is no longer locked up. "If they come home and find you gone, they will beat me," the boy says. The wild man says, in effect, "That's good thinking. You'd better come with me." So the wild man lifts the boy up on his shoulders, and together they go off into the woods. That's decisive. We should all be so lucky. As the boy leaves for the forest, he has to overcome, at least for the moment, his fear of wildness, irrationality, hairiness, intuition, emotion, the body, and nature. Iron John is not as primitive as the boy imagines, but the boy, or the mind, doesn't know that yet. Still, the clean break with the mother and father, which the old initiators call for, now has taken place. Iron John says to the boy, "You'll never see your mother and father again, but I have treasures more than you'll ever need." So that is that. The moment the boy leaves with Iron John is the moment in ancient Greek life when the priest of Dionysius accepted a young man as a student, or the moment in Eskimo life today when the shaman, sometimes entirely covered with the fur of wild animals, appears in the village and takes the boy away for spirit instruction. In our culture, there's no such moment. The boys in our culture have a continuing need for initiation into male spirit, but old men in general don't offer it. The priest sometimes tries, but he's too much a part of the corporate village these days. The fault of the nuclear family today isn't so much that it's crazy and full of double binds. That's true in communes and corporate offices too, in fact, in any group. The fault is that the old men outside the nuclear family no longer offer an effective way for the son to break his link with his parents without doing harm to himself. The ancient societies believed that a boy becomes a man only through ritual and effort, only through, quote, active intervention of the older men, unquote. It's becoming clear to us that manhood doesn't happen by itself. It doesn't happen just because we eat Wheaties. The active intervention of the older men means that the older men welcome the younger man into the ancient, mythologized, instinctual male world. Once that welcoming has been done, the older men teach him the myths, stories, and songs that embody distinctly male values. I mean, not competitive values only, but spiritual values. Once these quote, moistening, unquote, myths are learned, the myths themselves lead the young male far beyond his personal father and into the moistness of the swampy fathers who stretch back century after century. In the absence of old man's labor consciously done, what happens? Initiation of Western men has continued for some time in an altered form even after fanatics destroyed the Greek initiatory schools. During the 19th century, grandfathers and uncles lived in the house, and older men mingled a great deal. Through hunting parties and work that men did together in farms and cottages, through local sports, older men spent much time with younger men and brought knowledge of male spirit and soul to them. Much of that chance or incidental mingling has ended. Men's clubs and societies have steadily disappeared. Grandfathers live in Phoenix or the old people's homes, and many boys experience only the companionship of other boys their age, who, from the point of view of the old initiators, know nothing at all. During the 60s, some young men drew strength from women who in turn had received some of their strength from the women's movement. One could say that many young men in the 60s tried to accept initiation from women. But only men can initiate men, as only women can initiate women. So, what can be done? Thousands and thousands of women, being single parents, are raising boys with no adult man in the house. The difficulties inherent in that situation came up one day in Evanston when I was giving a talk on initiation of men to a group made up mostly of women. Women who are raising sons alone were extremely alert to the dangers of no male model. One woman declared that she realized about the time her son got to high school age that he needed more hardness than she could naturally give. But, she said, if she made herself harder to meet that need, she would lose touch with her own femininity. I mentioned the classic solution in many traditional cultures, which is to send the boy to his father when he's 12. Several women said flatly, "No, men aren't nurturing. They wouldn't take care of him." Many men, however, and I am one of them, have found inside an ability to nurture that didn't appear until it was called for. Even when a father is living in the house, there still may be a strong covert bond between mother and son to evict the father, which amounts to a conspiracy, and conspiracies are difficult to break. One woman with 2 sons had enjoyed going each year to a convention in San Francisco with her husband, the boys being left at home. But one spring, having just returned from a women's retreat, she felt like being private and said to her husband, "Why don't you take the boys this year?" So the father did. The boys around 10 or 12 had never, as it turned out, experienced their father's company without the mother's presence. After that experience, they asked for more time with their dad. When the convention time rolled around the following spring, the mother once more decided on privacy, and the boys once more set off with their father. The moment they arrived back home, the mother happened to be standing in the kitchen, with her back to the door, and the older of the 2 boys walked over and put his arms around her from the back. Without even intending it, her body reacted explosively, and the boy flew across the room and bounced off the wall. When he picked himself up, she said their relationship had changed. Something irrevocable had happened. She was glad about the change, and the boy seemed surprised and a little relieved that he apparently wasn't needed by her in the old way. Another woman told a story in which the mother-son conspiracy was broken from the boy's side. She was a single parent of a son and 2 daughters, and the girls were doing well, but the boy was not. At 14, the boy went to live with his father, but he stayed only a month or so and then came back. When he returned, the mother realized that 3 women in the house amounted to an overbalance of feminine energy for the son, but what could she do? A week or 2 went by. One night, she said to her son, "John, it's time to come to dinner." She touched him on the arm, and he exploded, and she flew against the wall. The same sort of explosion as in the earlier story. We notice no intent of abuse either time, and no evidence that the event was repeated. In each case, the psyche or body knew what the mind didn't. When the mother picked herself up off the floor, she said, "It's time for you to go back to your father." And the boy said, "You're right." The traditional initiation break is preferable and sidesteps the violence. But all over the country now, one sees hulking sons acting ugly in the kitchen and talking rudely to their mothers, and I think it's an attempt to make themselves unattractive. If the old men haven't done their work to interrupt the mother-son unity, what else can the boys do to extricate themselves but to talk ugly? It's quite unconscious, and there's no elegance in it at all. A clean break from the mother is crucial, but it's simply not happening. This doesn't mean that the women are doing something wrong. I think the problem is more that the older men are not really doing their job. The traditional way of raising sons, which lasted for thousands and thousands of years, amounted to fathers and sons living in close, murderously close proximity, while the father taught the son a trade, perhaps farming or carpentry or blacksmithing or tailoring. The love unit most damaged by the Industrial Revolution has been the father-son bond. There's no sense in idealizing pre-industrial culture. Yet we know that today many fathers now work 30 or 50 miles from the house, and by the time they return at night, the children are often in bed and they themselves are too tired to do active fathering. The German psychologist Alexander Mitscherlich writes about this father-son crisis in his book called Society Without the Father. The gist of his idea is that if the son does not actually see what his father does during the day and through all the seasons of the year, a hole will appear in the son's psyche, and the hole will fill with demons, who tell him that his father's work is evil and the father's evil. The son's fear that the absent father is evil contributed to student takeovers in the 60s. Rebellious students at Columbia University took over the president's office, looking for evidence of CIA involvement with the university. The students' fear that their own fathers were evil was transferred to all male figures in authority. A university like a father looks upright and decent on the outside, but underneath, somewhere, you have the feeling that it and he are doing something demonic. That feeling becomes intolerable, because the son's inner intuitions become incongruous with outer appearances. The unconscious intuitions come in, not because the father is wicked, but because the father is remote. Young people go to the trouble of invading the president's office to bridge this incongruity. The country being what it is, occasionally they do find letters from the CIA. But this doesn't satisfy the deeper longing, the need of the son's body to be closer to the father's body. When the demons are so suspicious, how can the son later make any good connection with adult male energy, especially the energy of an adult man in a position of authority or leadership? As a musician, he will smash handcrafted guitars made by old men. As a citizen, he will take part in therapy rather than politics. He will feel pure when not in authority. There's a general assumption now that every man in a position of power is or will soon be corrupt and oppressive. Yet the Greeks understood and praised the positive male energy that has accepted authority. They called it Zeus energy, which encompasses intelligence, robust health, compassionate decisiveness, goodwill, generous leadership. Zeus energy is male authority accepted for the sake of the community. Zeus energy has been steadily disintegrating decade after decade in the United States. Popular culture has been determined to destroy respect for it, beginning with the Maggie and Jiggs and Blondie and Dagwood comics of the 1920s and 1930s, in which a man is always weak and foolish. From there, the image of the weak adult man went into animated cartoons. The father in contemporary TV ads never knows what cold medicine to take. And in situation comedies, The Cosby Show notwithstanding, men are devious, bumbling, or easy to outwit. It is the women who outwit them and teach them a lesson, or hold the whole town together all by themselves. This is not exactly what people want. Many young Hollywood writers, rather than confronting their fathers in Kansas, take revenge on the remote father by making all adult men look like fools. They attack the respect for masculine integrity that every father underneath wants to pass on to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. By contrast, in traditional cultures, the older men and the older women often are the first to speak in public gatherings. Younger men may say nothing, but still aim to maintain contact with the older men. Now we have 27-year-olds engaged in hostile takeovers who will buy out a publishing house and dismantle in 6 months what an older man has created over a period of 30 years. Jung said that when the son is introduced primarily by the mother to feeling, he will learn the female attitude towards masculinity, and he will take a female view of his own father and of his own masculinity. He will see the father through the mother's eyes. A friend of mine mentioned that he realized when he became about 35 that he didn't really know his father. His father had been living in Seattle for 10 years or so. So he flew to Seattle one day, went to his father's house, knocked on the door, and when his father came, said to him, "I want you to know that I don't accept my mother's view of you anymore." I said to him, "What did the father do?" He said, "Well, my father burst into tears and then said, 'Now I can die.'" Since the father and the mother are in competition for the affection of the son, you're not going to get a straight picture of your father out of your mother, nor will you get a straight picture of your mother out of your father. Some mothers send out messages that civilization and culture and feeling and relationships are things which the mother and the daughter, or the mother and the sensitive son, share in common, whereas the father stands for and embodies what is stiff, maybe brutal, what is unfeeling, obsessed, rationalistic, money-mad, uncompassionate. So the son often grows up with a wounded image of his father, not brought about necessarily by the father's actions or words, but based on the mother's observation of these words or actions. I am not saying that all fathers are good. Mothers can be right about the father's negative side, but the woman can also be judgmental about masculine traits that are merely different or unexpected. Eventually, a man needs to throw off all indoctrination and begin to discover for himself what the father is and what masculinity is. For that task, ancient stories are a good help, because they are free of modern psychological prejudices, because they have endured the scrutiny of generations of women and men, and because they give both the light and dark sides of manhood, the admirable and the dangerous. These powerful energies inside men are lying like Iron John in ponds we haven't walked past yet. It is good that the divine is associated with the Virgin Mary and a blissful Jesus, but we can sense how different it would be for young men if we lived in a culture where the divine was also associated with a being entirely underwater, covered with hair. When a man gets in touch with the wild man, a true strength may be added. He's able to shout and say what he wants to say in a way that the 60s or 70s man is not able to. The ability of a man to shout and to be fierce does not imply domination, treating people as if they were objects, demanding land or empire, holding on to the Cold War, the whole model of machismo. Women in the 1970s needed to develop what is known in the Indian tradition as Kali energy, the ability to say what they want, to dance with skulls around their neck, to cut relationships when they need to. Men need to make a parallel connection with the harsh Dionysius energy that the Indians call Kala. Our story says that the first step is to find the wild man lying at the bottom of the pond. We could ask, why not stop here? We have a young man who has stolen the key from under his mother's pillow. He has escaped from mother and father, and he is in touch with the wild man, and through him the wilderness. Like Huck Finn, he has started, quote, down the Mississippi, unquote, on a raft with a companion from a different world. But if our story describes initiation, we know we have still to deal with some sort of wound. The breaking of a bone, a puncture to the skin, a making of wound patterns in the body, that's all part of it. Mircea Eliade, in his reports of initiation experiences in dozens of cultures all over the world, mentions that the initiation of boys begins with two events. The first is a clean break with the parents, after which the novice goes to the forest, desert, or wilderness. The second is a wound that the older men give the boy, which could be a scarring of the skin, a cut with a knife, a brushing with nettles, a tooth knocked out. But we mustn't leap to the assumption that the injuries are given sadistically. Initiators of young men in most cultures make sure that the injuries they give do not lead to meaningless pain, but reverberate out from a rich center of meaning. Early adolescence is the time traditionally chosen for initiation to begin, and we all recall how many injuries we received at that age. Something in the adolescent male wants risk, courts danger, goes out to the edge, even to the edge of death. In our story, then, the boy's finger hints of wounds each of us have already received in our attempts to let the wild man out of the cage. Old men don't give us the wound. We do it ourselves. Whether the old men of the past scar us with a seashell or tattoo us painfully, or we do it ourselves, the scar stands for a wound that's already there, some missing tooth that we've each felt with our tongues. The wounded finger in our story stands for a wound most young men in our culture have already received. Let's go back, then, to the story. We are leaving our time now. There are places where time moves more slowly than here. We honor all four directions, east, west, north, south. And we also honor the fifth direction, the vertical one, which is in us here today. When the wild man had reached the dark forest once more, he took the boy from his shoulders, put him down in the earth, and said, "You will never see your mother and father again, but I will keep you with me, for you have set me free, and I feel compassion for you. If you do everything as I tell you, all will go well. I have much gold and treasure, more than anyone else in the world." The wild man prepared a bed of moss for the boy to sleep on, and in the morning took him to a spring. Do you see this golden spring? It is clear as crystal and full of light. I want you to sit beside it and make sure that nothing falls into it, because if that happens, it will wrong the spring. I'll return each evening to see if you've obeyed my order. The boy sat down at the spring's edge. Occasionally he glimpsed a golden fish or a gold snake, and he took care to let nothing fall in. But as he sat there, his wounded finger was so painful that without intending to, he dipped it into the water. He pulled it out instantly, but he saw that the finger had turned to gold, and no matter how much he washed it, the washing did no good. Iron John came back that evening and said, "Anything happened with the spring today?" The boy held his finger behind his back to keep Iron John from seeing it, and he said, "No, nothing at all." "Ah, you've dipped your finger in the spring," said the wild man. "We can let it pass this once, but don't let that happen again." Now, if we are to live in this story, rather than merely observe it, we have to ask ourselves, what wound do we have that hurts so much that we have to dip it in the water? Initiation, then, for young men amounts to helping them remember the wound. And by that, we mean the soul wounds, or the injuries to the emotional body. Sometimes the outward scars exist to remind us of inward scars. Some blow usually comes from the father, one way or another. Not receiving any blessing from your father is an injury. Not seeing your father when you are small, never being with him, having a remote father, an absent father, a workaholic father, is an injury. Michael Meade found an African story in which the hunter father takes his boy hunting with him one day. Having killed a small rat, he asked the boy to keep it. The son, in the story says, thinking it was nothing, threw it in the bush. No more game comes along that day, and at dusk the father asks the boy for the rat so they can cook it and have something to eat. The boy says to the father, "I threw it in the bush." And then, according to the story, quote, the father took up his axe and hit his son, who was knocked unconscious, and the father then left the boy lying where he was. Men who hear this incident know in the most astonishing detail where that axe blow hit. One man says the axe hit on the left side of his head. Another said it landed in the chest area. Another, in my groin, and so on and so on. Almost every man remembers that blow coming in. So, this event seems to be a part of father-son material. The father gives a blow, and the son gets it. And it's a wound the boy remembers for years. And what of the blows from the mother? "Oh, you're very frail, you know. You shouldn't play with those boys. If you don't stop that, I'll send you to a foster home. See how you like that?" Now you're acting just like your father. The father gives the son a vivid and unforgettable blow with an axe, which has the hint of murder in it. Many a mother makes sure the son receives a baptism of shame. She keeps pouring the water of shame over his head to make sure. These wounds come into us whether we honor our parents or not, whether we are good or bad. Many of them we can describe as wounds to our grandiosity. When we are tiny, we have the feeling that we are God. Our kingly life in the womb pointed to some such possibility, and if anyone, once we're out, tries to tell us we are not God, we don't hear it. This early sense of our godliness we could call infantile grandiosity, and we need to distinguish that from greatness or true grandiosity or grandeur, which is a part of us also. At any rate, as adolescents we still have enough infantile grandiosity, so we imagine we can decide whether the rat is big enough to keep or not. Then, when the father hits us with an axe and leaves us lying on the ground, we find our condition, wounded, on the ground, difficult to reconcile with our fantasy of princehood. We usually solve the problem by inflating ourselves further. A little ascension takes us above it all. Perhaps some grandiosity or godlikeness is useful in protecting ourselves when we are very young. Alice Miller remarks that when abuse enters, when the parents do cruelties the child cannot imagine any parent doing, it takes either a grandiose road or a depressed road. If we take the grandiose road, we climb up above the wound and above the shame. Perhaps we do get good grades, become the one in the family hired to be cheerful, become a sort of doctor of our own suffering, take care of others. Something prodigious carries us away. We can be cheerful, but not very human. If we take the depressed road, we live inside the wound and inside the shame. We are actually closer to the wound than those on the grandiose path, but we are not necessarily more human. The victim is an imposing person too. The victim accepts the crown of victimhood, becomes a prince and princess in another way. Sometimes men with no fathers take these roads. Ancient initiation practices would affect all these responses, since it gives a new wound, or gives a calculated wound sufficiently pungent and vivid, though minor, so that the young man remembers his inner wounds. The initiation then tells the young man what to do with wounds, both the new and the old. The old men tell the boys stories as soon as they enter the men's world. If we have no story, we cannot take a hold of our own wound. We either climb above it, so far up that we can't reach down to take a hold of the wound, or we become the wound, get stepped on by something so huge we see only the ground below us. The ancient practice of initiation, then, still very much alive in our genetic structure, offers a third way through. A mentor, or, quote, male mother, unquote, enters the landscape. Behind him, a person of impersonal intensity stands, which in our story is the wild man, or Iron John. The young man investigates or experiences his wound, father wound, mother wound, shaming wound, in the presence of this independent, timeless, mythological, initiatory being. If the young man steals the key and climbs onto the shoulders of this being, three things will change. The wound, rather than being regarded as bad luck, will be seen as a gift. Second, the sacred or secret water, whatever that is, will appear. Finally, the energy of the sun will somehow be carried into the man's body. The wild man in our story takes the boy to a sacred spring to water. We note that golden fish and gold snakes swim in this water. Mythologically, this is the old sacred spring guarded by the wild man and sometimes by the wild woman as well. If this spring is ever polluted, the old Celtic stories say, then everything on the earth will die. So the water is an important place. Psychologically, this is the water of soul life, but only for those ready to go in. Those working with alcoholic families in the last 10 years have made much of the word denial, and it's a good word. Denial stands for amnesia, forgetfulness, oblivion. An ocean of oblivion sweeps over a child when it is shamed. Denial means we have been entranced. We live for years in a trance. Being brought to the water by a mentor means the end of enchantment. The wild man's water does not itself heal the wound that led to escape or to ascension, but it gives strength to the part of us that wants to continue the effort to gain courage and to be human. When Iron John takes the boy to the water, the energy of the sun is somehow carried into the young man's body. The story says it this way. Without intending to, he dipped it into the water. He pulled it out instantly, but he saw that the finger had turned to gold. Gold all over the world suggests a sun glory, royal power, self-generating radiance, freedom from decay, immortality, spiritual luminosity, and it is that gold which has come to the boy's finger. By arranging the surprise of the golden fingertip, the wild man, acting as a spiritual guide here, gives the promise. The promise is a rediscovery, we could say, a rediscovery of a gold that was always there. We do not laboriously, by hard labor in grade school, accumulate a store of sun energy in the spirit warehouse. The gold was in us while we were in the womb. Psychologically, what is the gold in the finger? The story says that when we're in the presence of either a mentor or the wild man, a hint will come to us as to where our genius lies. An artist feels a curious mood of intensity when he or she is working on an art object, a poem or a painting or a sculpture. We could say that the sacred pond is right there in the studio, and the artist becomes capable of thoughts and feelings much wilder than he or she ever experiences in shut-down days. The fingers holding the pen or the brush turn gold, and we suddenly see amazing images and realize what we are really good at. The wound that hurts us so much that we involuntarily dip it in the water, we have to regard as a gift. How would the boy in our story have found out about his genius if he had not been wounded? Those with no wounds are the unluckiest of all. Of course, one can't even think that, because no such person has ever been found. But men are taught over and over when they are boys that a wound that hurts is shameful. A wound that stops you from continuing to play is a girlish wound. He who is truly a man keeps walking, dragging his guts behind him. Our story gives a teaching diametrically opposite. It says that where a man's wound is, that is where his genius will be. Wherever the wound appears in our psyches, whether from alcoholic father, shaming mother, shaming father, abusing mother, whether it stems from isolation, disability, or disease, that is precisely the place from which we will give our major gift to the community. Now, let's return to the story. We are leaving our time now. We are leaving our time now. There are 7 oceans on this planet. We are going now to the 8th ocean. Early the next morning, the boy sat again at the spring watching over it. His finger still hurt, and after a while he ran his hand up through his hair. One hair, alas, came loose from his head and fell into the spring. He immediately reached down and pulled it out, but the hair had already turned to gold. The moment Iron John returned, he knew what had happened. "Ah, you've let a hair fall into the spring. I'll allow it this time, but if it happens a 3rd time, it will dishonor the spring, and you will not be able to stay with me any longer." We could say that the boy in our story has elevated his wounded finger this time. And that's a little different from dipping it. First a man dips his wound, one could say, into psychological water, and then he elevates it into mythological space. Wounds need to be expanded into air, lifted up on ideas our ancestors knew, so that the wound ascends through the roof of our parents' house, and we suddenly see how our wound, seemingly so private, fits into a great and impersonal story. Mythology helps to give weight to our private wounds. To feel the wound in a particular part of our body gives our wound weight, and to understand it as a part of an ancient story gives it weight. Without the weight given by a wound consciously realized, the man will lead a provisional life. The wounded finger this time gets associated with hair. Hair covers the wild man and the wild woman, as we know from many sources. The question of hair comes up a lot in this story. When we look for cultural associations with the word hair, we notice at least 4 linkages. The first is the sexual energy. When a young Roman woman joined the Vestal Virgins, the other women ritually shaved her head. Monks during the Middle Ages were tonsured, and Orthodox Jewish women to this day wear wigs to hide their own hair. Because animals exhibit hair in profusion, and because we see our own sexuality as animal, that linkage is unavoidable. Hunters traditionally wear long hair, as do the animals that they hunt. Hair, then, can stand for animal life in general, particularly the life of wild animals. Hair suggests not only closeness to animals through hunting or domestication, but it suggests all forms of animal hot-bloodedness. Reptiles, cold-blooded, lack hair, and so hair comes to represent that passionate, flaring nature peculiar to mammals. Hot tempers, redheads, fiery temperaments, passionate impulsiveness, spontaneity, explosive emotions, leonine fierceness, tigerish jealousy. Finally, hair suggests excess. The hairiness of Enkidu, the Babylonian wild man, or Pan, the goat man, suggests that hair stands for what is beyond the boundaries of all middle-of-the-road civilization. Pan is outside the enclosure. When the boy in our story then inadvertently dislodges one hair that falls into the spring and it turns to gold, we could say that he learns these things: that sexual energy is good, that the hunting instinct, which mammals possess without shame, is good, that animal heat, fierceness, and passionate spontaneity is good, and that excess, extravagances, and going with Pan out beyond the castle boundaries is good too. We'll continue the story now with the third day. We're leaving our time once more. We're going to a time before time appeared on the clock faces, before it appeared on our wrists. The third day, as the boy sat by the spring, he was determined, no matter how much his finger hurt him, not to let it move. Time passed slowly, and he began gazing at the reflection of his face in the water. He got the desire to look straight into his own eyes. And in doing this, he leaned over farther and farther. All at once, his long hair fell down over his forehead and into the water. He threw his head back, but now all his hair, every bit, had turned gold, and it shone as if it were the sun itself. Now the boy was frightened. He took out a kerchief and covered his head so that the wild man wouldn't know what had happened. But when Iron John arrived home, he knew immediately. "Take the kerchief off your head," he said. The golden hair then came tumbling down over the boy's shoulders, and the boy had to be silent. In our story, the boy's hands now remain behind his back. It isn't the hands that reach out now, but the eyes. The eyes began to search around him, their curiosity perhaps intensified by the intimation that gold is everywhere, mysteriously present even in clear water. He focuses on his own face, finally on his own eyes. We know that shame often keeps us from meeting other people's eyes, or our own. But when we do look into our own eyes, whether we do that staring into a mirror or into a pond surface, we have the inescapable impression, so powerful and astonishing, that someone is looking back at us. The person who gazes in the mirror receives an awareness of his other half, his shadow, or hidden man. Awareness of that hidden man is a proper aim for all initiation. The experience teaches him that the eyes he sees are not just him, but some other man, not included very well under the name his parents gave him. The one looking back is at the same time a man's shadow or dark side, but also his spiritual twin, his white shadow. Rolf Jacobson, the Norwegian poet, calls him your shadow, the white one, whom you cannot accept, and who will never forget you. The Gnostics spoke a great deal about the twin, whom they imagined to have been separated from us at birth. The twin retains the spiritual knowledge given us before birth. The twin, when he or she re-enters the psyche, insists on intensity and seriousness. In our story, there is no mirror. The mirror is made by nature, or more exactly, it is nature. We could say that the boy in our story has seen eyes looking back at him from nature. The story implies that we, as human beings, are not the only source of ordered intelligence and conscious awareness. The eyes in the water can be regarded as an emblem of the consciousness in nature, the intelligence out there. We could sum up by saying that when a man has received a glimpse of his own psychic twin, and when he has seen the intelligence in nature, its consciousness or intent, then that man's hair turns gold. He has a golden head. We note that the boy in our story seems very young to have a golden head. We gather from the way he hides it under the kerchief that he feels it is not proper and right to show it. 3 days have now passed in ritual time. These 3 days could be 15 years in our time. The initiator gives the boy a task, and he failed at it 3 times. But he receives a gift anyway each time. The failures rose from the pain he felt and from his human inability to keep attention, but the gift came from the water, with whom he has somehow established a relationship. We deduce that accepting an initiatory task is more important than succeeding or failing at it. We would guess that the boy has done all right. If we return to the story now, we hear Iron John's final words after the 3 days at the pond. Iron John says, "You can't stay here any longer because you didn't make it through the trial. Go out into the world now, and there you will learn what poverty is. I see no evil in your heart, however, and I wish you well, so I give you this gift. Whenever you are in trouble, come to the edge of the forest and shout, 'Iron John, Iron John, Iron John.' I'll come to the edge of the forest and help you. My power is great, greater than you believe, and I have gold and silver in abundance." We're moving into a new section of the story soon, and we might look back on the boy's progress so far. The king's son, in following the wild man, has not gone the way of delinquency, drug addiction, and self-shaming. On the contrary, he has been lifted up to what is great in him. It is as if his teacher in high school had been Pablo Casals, who taught him what genius is, and by commenting on the gold tip of his finger, convinced him that he had some. He also learned to trust his instinctual body, or hair, and finally, he sees eyes looking back at him from the water, and by extension, looking at him from the grass, the trees, the mountains. He learned that the whole world is on fire. As Pythagoras said, everything is intelligent. All of his hair turns gold. Such teaching can have strange effects. If such good luck happened to one of us, a friend would probably warn us that we are in danger of becoming overly grand. Young men, when lifted up, may become white swans, grandiose ascenders, flying boys, just as young women, similarly lifted up, may become flying girls. These flying people, giddily spiritual, do not inhabit their bodies well, and are open to terrible shocks of abandonment. They are unable to accept limitations and are averse to a certain boring quality native to human life. We need to add that not all young men are ascenders. Some are earthbound, take on responsibility too early, commit themselves to supporting others. They walk slowly, move close to the ground, carry enormous burdens, feel they have no right to look even at slivers of sunlight. Their family tradition is that the sun's grandiosity is to be wiped out early. Sometimes in those families, the women are the inflated ones, and the men are not. Men take the depressed road. They do not become artists or musicians. Their life takes place where the soles of their shoes touch the ground. Some fairy tales call them shoemakers, and they note the tension between them and what the fairy tales call tailors. The boy in our story is at the moment of ascension now. As such, he's similar, for better or worse, to millions of men and women in American culture now. We have to look very carefully at these ascenders, these tailors or flyers, if we are going to make any change in men and women's lives, and we might look at them in the light of 3 words: passivity, naivete, and numbness. We know that for hundreds of years, men have admired each other and been admired by women, in particular for their activity. Men and women alike once called on men to pierce the dangerous places, carry handfuls of courage to the waterfalls, dust the tails of the wild boars. All know that if men did that well, the women and children could sleep safely. Now the boars have turned to pigs in the stockyard, and the rushing rivers to the waterfall in the Museum of Modern Art courtyard. The activity men were once loved for is not required. During the last 30 years, men have been asked to learn how to go with the flow, how to follow rather than lead, how to live in a non-hierarchical way, how to be vulnerable, how to adopt consensus decision-making. Some women want a passive man if they want a man at all. The church wants a tamed man, they're called priests. The university wants a domesticated man, they're called tenure-track people. The corporation wants a team worker, and so on. William Blake roots passivity in earliest childhood. Struggling in my father's hands, striving against my swaddling bands, bound and weary, I thought best to sulk upon my mother's breast. The infant boy struggles against the father's hands, fighting the narcissistic father's desire to bind or murder him. And he struggles against swaddling bands, fighting the narcissistic mother's desire to change him to what she wants. When the boy fails to get free, then, Blake says, he learns to sulk. How often every adult man has felt himself when baffled by a woman's peculiar interpretation of his behavior, so different from his own, go into a sulk. In such a mood, screaming, shouting, kvetching never appear. These are too active. When a man sulks, he becomes passive to his own hurts. When no old men appear to break the hold of the sulking infant, the habit of passivity spreads to other parts of his life. The passive man, for example, may ask the woman to do his loving for him. Talking is not everything, but it is a part of loving, as are buying gifts, getting to completion, as they say, in a conversation, praising the other person, keeping the thread of intimacy unbroken. Maggie Scarf remarks in Intimate Partners that 3/4 or so of American marriages follow a curious scenario. The woman wants more intimacy and the man flees from that. She runs after, but not quite fast enough to catch him. And he flees, but not quite fast enough to get away. This game can go on for years. The passive man may not say what he wants, and the girlfriend or wife has to guess it. As a compensation for passivity at home, he may go into robot production at work, but that isn't really what he wants either. We see more and more passivity in men, but also more and more naivete. The word special is important to the naive man, as he has special relationships with certain people whose dark side he never investigates. The naive man loves sincerity and assumes it should and will protect him from consequences of his acts. The naive man will lose what is most precious to him because of a lack of boundaries. He tends as well to have an inappropriate relation to ecstasy, finding great mother ecstasies very easy. Finally, the naive man often doesn't know that there's a being in him that wants to remain sick. The naive man in general feels a pride in being attacked. If his wife or girlfriend, furious, shouts that he is a chauvinist, a sexist, a man, he opens his shirt so she can see more clearly where to put the lances. He ends with 3 or 4 javelins sticking out of his chest and blood all over the floor. He feels, as he absorbs attacks, that he is doing the brave and advanced thing. He will surely be able to recover somewhere in isolation. The naive man will also be proud that he can pick up the pain of others. He particularly picks up women's pain. In general, I think each gender drops its own pain when it tries to carry the pain of the other gender. I don't mean that men shouldn't listen, but hearing a woman's pain and carrying it are two different things. Women have tried for centuries to carry men's pain, and that hasn't worked well. We have talked of passivity and naivete, and now we'll add the third word, numbness. A spiritual man may love light and yet be entirely numb, in the chest area. I'll set down a personal fable. When I was 2 or 3 years old, I went to my father and I asked him for protection. But he was an intense man, and being with him felt more dangerous than being out in the street. I then went to my mother and I asked her for protection. At the instant she said yes, I went numb from my neck down to my lower belly. That's the fable. It may not be true. I don't know at what age my numbness came. Perhaps I had a genetic expectation that my father would protect me, and when that didn't happen, I went numb from the shock of it. It's also possible that I knew, or thought I knew, that if I accepted my mother's protection, I would have to learn to feel as a woman feels. But I was a man, and so I decided, rather than that, to have no feelings at all. The fable does suggest that a mother's protection, no matter how well-intentioned, will not do as a substitute for the father's protection. My chest area remained numb up to and through high school. My head was fiery and full of blood, and my genitals were fiery and curious too. The area in between was the problem. In high school, a girl might ask, "Do you love me?" I couldn't answer. If I asked her the same question, she might reply, "Well, I respect you, and I admire you, and I'm fond of you, and I'm even interested in you, but I don't love you." Apparently, when she looked into her chest, she saw a whole spectrum of affections, a whole procession of feelings, and she could easily tell them all apart. If I looked down into my chest, I saw nothing at all. I had then either to remain silent or fake it. Some women feel hurt when a man will not, in quotation marks, express his feelings, unquote, and they conclude that he's holding back or telling them something by such withholding. But it's more likely that when such a man asks a question of his chest, he gets no answer at all. Some of that numbness is gone in me now. I can answer questions about my feelings, and I can see people down there with different colored robes walking around and tell one from the other. It's possible that as a man gets older, certain numb parts of his body naturally come to life. It's also possible that the numbness moves away as we learn to go to other people besides our parents for protection. If the golden boy in our story is an ascender and a flyer after he leaves the spring, then Iron John is quite correct when he says to the boy, in essence, "You know a great deal about gold now, but nothing about poverty." In effect, he says, "You know a lot about going up and nothing about going down." And this is the way the story talks about his leaving the spring. We are leaving our time now. We are going to a place where time moves more slowly. Then the king's son left the forest, and he walked by beaten and unbeaten paths, ever onwards, until at last he reached a great city. And there he looked for work, but could find none. And he had learned nothing by which he could help himself. At length he went to the palace and asked if they would take him in. The people about court did not at all know what use they could make of him, but they liked him and they told him to stay. At length the cook took him into his service and said that he might carry wood and water and rake the cinders together. The king's son is going to experience something completely different now. To fall from being a king's son to being a cook is the step the story asks for. Carrying wood and water, working in the basement of the castle where the kitchen is, stands for the drop through the floor, the descent, the humiliation, the way down and out. We find that phrase in George Orwell's title, Down and Out in Paris and London. When Orwell decided to go beyond the naivete he inherited from his middle-class upbringing, he too got a job in the basement, and his novel is full of the underground life of the kitchen help in big hotels. For young men who have graduated from privileged colleges or who have been lifted upward by the expensive entitlement culture, their soul life often begins with this basement work in the kitchen. The way down and out usually separates the young man from his companion flyers and from their support, and it makes him aware of a depression that may have been living unnoticed in him for years. A mean life of ordinariness, heaviness, silence, cracks in the road, weightiness, and soberness begins. Our story simply says that after wandering around a while, having no craft, the young man at last got a job in the kitchen, which is traditionally in the basement of a castle. The story says that after all the gold fingertips and hair, what is proper next for the man is the whirlpool, the sinking through the floor, the drop, what the ancient Greeks called katabasis. There is something more than a little frightening about this drop. Our ego doesn't want to do it. And even if we drop, the ego doesn't want to see it. The sounds in katabasis, harsh and abrupt, feel right for this trip. We remember Oedipus and his katabasis. One day an arrogant, demanding king, the next a blind man led around by others. These days, katabasis comes about through addiction, alcohol, cocaine, crack. The man loses his health and ends up with thin legs, flat energy, deprived of wife and children, deprived of friends, house, money. He loses his job, self-respect, quote, and every mark of his former art and life. The way down and out doesn't require poverty, homelessness, physical deprivation, dishwasher work necessarily, but it does seem to require a fall from status, from a human being to a spider, from a middle-class person to a derelict. The emphasis is on the consciousness of the fall. One has the sense that some power in the psyche arranges a severe katabasis if the man does not know enough to go down on his own. Depression is a small katabasis, and something other than us arranges it. Depression usually surprises us by its arrival and by its departure. In depression, we refuse to go down, and so a hand comes up and pulls us down. In grief, we choose to go down. With initiators gone from our culture, we do not receive instruction on how to go down on our own. We could use the phrase, going into grief, for the conscious act of descent. But one sometimes feels that in the United States, a man is supposed to feel grief only at a funeral. Descent or kitchen work can take two other forms. We'll name these as taking the road of ashes and moving from the mother's world to the father's world. Ashes and cinders, in fairy tales, are code words for the ashy, sooty, depressed, out-of-it time. We imagine in our day that to be assigned to the hearth is some sort of punishment, but in the fairy tales, that assignment goes to the lucky third son, who is the magical ashy fool, and to the lucky third daughter. Cinderella, the magical suffering child of the mother, is one. For those children, tending the hearth is the right task. To live the life of ashes is very different from dropping into katabasis. It doesn't require a fall in social status. It is not so explosive. There is something about ashes that is steady, even lethargic. Young men in Viking times, according to the Norwegian scholar R. Kaiser, were allowed sometimes 2 or 3 years of ashes. Norwegians at that time lived in long communal houses, not unlike the log houses of the West Coast Indians. In his book on the Old Norsemen, Kaiser described how 30 or 40 people slept in the beds along the walls. Down the center of the hall, they laid out a pavement which acted as a fireplace. Smoke went up through holes in the roof. Ashes lay in long heaps, 2 or 3 feet from the pavement, between it and the beds. It turned out that young men sometimes would lie down in that space, between the fire and the ash pile, and stay there 2 or 3 years. According to Kaiser, such as these might constantly be seen crouching over the fire, rolling themselves in the ashes, eating ashes, and neither caring to employ themselves in anything useful, nor to keep themselves in a state of cleanliness. Apparently some also chewed cinders. They were called cinder biters. It's clear that the young men were going through some kind of hibernation or ritual lethargy, and the older men and women allowed it. If a young man now feels the need to drop out of school, there is no ritual for that, and he may easily end up shamed or worse in prison. Kaiser mentions a cinderbiter in the 11th century named Starkad, who remained in the ashes several years until his foster father invited him to go on an expedition. At that point, he stood up, shaved and dressed, and became one of the best warriors on the expedition, and later became a distinguished poet as well, remembered in the sagas. Despite our Disneyland culture, some men around 35 or 40 will begin to experience ashes privately, without ritual, even without old men. They begin to notice how many of their dreams have turned to ashes. A young man in high school dreams that he'll be a race driver, a mountain climber, he'll marry Miss America, he'll be a millionaire by 30, he'll get a Nobel Prize in physics by 35, he'll be an architect and build the tallest building ever. He will get out of his hick town and live in Paris. He will have fabulous friends. And by 35, all these dreams are ashes. At 35, his inner stove begins to produce ashes as well. All through his 20s, his stove burned with such a good draft that he threw in whole nights until dawn, drinking parties, sexual extravagance, enthusiasm, madness, excitement. Then one day, he noticed that his stove doesn't take such big chunks anymore. He opens the stove door, and ashes fall out on the floor. It's time to buy a small black shovel at the hardware store and get down on his knees. Franklin Roosevelt found his ashes in his polio, Anwar Sadat in his prison, Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag. Some of our liveliest writers, John Steinbeck, William Faulkner, Thomas McGrath, Tilly Olson, David Ignatow, Kenneth Rexroth, found their ashes in the poverty of the Depression. We could say that a man finds katabasis only through dropping, poverty, abrupt change in social class, and prison is a traditional place to experience both katabasis and ashes. But a man may keep his job and family and still experience ashes if he knows what he's doing. When initiation is in place, the old men help the boys to move from the mother's world to the father's world, and we'll call that the third form of the descent. Boys have lived happily since birth in the mother's world, and the father's world naturally seems to them dangerous, unsteady, and full of unknowns. We recall that most cultures describe the first stage of initiation as a sharp and clean break with the mother. Old men simply go into the women's compounds with spears one day, when the boys are between 8 and 12, and take the boys away. When gender issues, as we call them, are well understood, the women do not oppose the initiatory work with the boys, nor helplessly yearn for it, but participate enthusiastically and sadly in the drama of it. The relevant sentence is the one accepted in New Guinea by men and women of 80 or so tribes. A boy cannot change into a man without the active intervention of the older men. So the first stage, then, is a clean break with the mother. That happens in our story when the wild man takes the boy on his shoulders. But a break is only a break, and it doesn't imply any internal movement inside the boy. All that is still to happen. With most of us, it is still happening. Simply put, the boy needs to move from the mother's house to the father's house. Shakespeare's Hamlet describes with fantastic wit and in heartbreaking detail the difficulty of this move. If no old man or competent initiator is present at this stage, and Polonius certainly is not such a man, all moves slowly. We learn one more thing from Hamlet. A young man cannot make the move to the father's world alone without taking into himself the dark side of the trickster. A man's effort to move to the father's house takes a long time. It's difficult, and each man has to do it for himself. For Hamlet, it meant giving up the immortality or the safe life promised to the faithful mother's son, and accepting the risk of death always imminent in the father's realm. Moving to the father's world does not necessarily mean rejecting the mother or shouting at her. Hamlet is off in that respect, but rather the movement involves convincing the naive boy or the comfort-loving boy to die. We surmise, then, that when a man accepts the descent as a way to move to the father's house, he learns to look at the death side of things, accepts the snake rather than the bird as his animal, increases his tolerance for ashes, and Saturn becomes his god. Saturn helps men to get heavy with the full weight of their wound and the full power of their failures. As I've participated in men's gatherings since the early 1980s, I've heard one statement over and over from American men, which has been phrased in 100 different ways. There is not enough father. The sentence implies that father is a substance like salt, which in earlier times was occasionally in short supply, or like groundwater, which in some areas now has simply disappeared. Geoffrey Gore remarked in his book, The American People, that for a boy to become a man in the United States in 1940, only one thing was required, namely, that he reject his father. He noticed, moreover, that American fathers expect to be rejected. Young men in Europe, by contrast, have traditionally imagined the father to be a demonic being whom they must wrestle with. Many sons in the United States, however, visualize the father as a simple object of ridicule to be made fun of, as in fact he is so often in comic strips and television commercials. One young man summed it up: "A father is a person who rustles newspapers in the living room." Traditional cultures still in existence seem to have plenty of father. In so-called traditional cultures, many substitute fathers work with the young man. Uncles loosen the son up or tell him about women. Grandfathers give him stories. Warrior types teach weaponry and discipline. Old men teach ritual and soul. All of them honorary fathers. Fathers and sons in most tribal cultures live in an amused tolerance of each other. The son has a lot to learn, and so the father and son spend hours trying and failing together to make arrowheads or to repair a spear or track a clever animal. When a father and son do spend long hours together, which some fathers and sons still do, we could say that a substance almost like food passes from the older body to the younger. The contemporary mind might want to describe the exchange between father and son as a likening of attitude, a miming, but I think a physical exchange takes place, as if some substance was passing directly to the cells. The son's body, not his mind, receives, and the father gives this food at a level far below consciousness. The son does not receive a hands-on healing, but a body-on healing. His cells receive some knowledge of what an adult masculine body is. The younger body learns at what frequency the masculine body vibrates. It begins to grasp the song that adult male cells sing, and how the charming, elegant, lonely, courageous, half-shamed male molecules dance. When a father absent during the day returns home at 6, his children receive only his temperament, and not his teaching. If the father is working for a corporation, what is there to teach? He is reluctant to tell his son what is really going on. The fragmentation of decision-making in corporate life, the massive effort that produces the corporate willingness to destroy the environment for the sake of profit, the prudence, even cowardice that one learns in bureaucracy, who wants to teach that? No historical models prepare us for the contemporary son's psychic condition. To understand the son's psyche, we have to imagine new furniture, new psychic figures, new demon possessions, new terrors, new incapacities, new flights. Enormous changes have appeared at the last minute. Few of us, fathers or sons, are prepared for such vast changes. I have mentioned so far the young men's father hunger and the starving bodies of the sons. We might look now at the disappearance of positive kings. The patriarchy is a complicated structure. Mythologically, it's matriarchal on the inside, and the matriarchy is equally complicated, being patriarchal on the inside. The political structure has to resemble our interior structure, and we know that each man has a woman inside him, and each woman has a man inside her. The genuine patriarchy brings down the son through the sacred king into every man and woman in the culture, and the genuine matriarchy brings down the moon through the sacred queen into every woman and every man in the culture. The death of the sacred king and queen means that we live now in a system of industrial domination, which is not patriarchy. The system we live in gives no honor to the male mode of feeling nor to the female mode of feeling. The system of industrial domination determines how things go with us in the world of resources, values, and allegiances, what animals live and what animals die, how children are treated, and in the mode of industrial domination there is neither king nor queen. The death of the sacred king and the disappearance of the group king means that the father shortage becomes still more acute. When a father now sits down at the table, he seems weak and insignificant, and we all sense that fathers no longer fill as large a space in the room as 19th century fathers did. As the father seems more and more enfeebled, dejected, paltry, he also appears to be the tool of dark forces. We remember that in Star Wars we are given an image of Darth Vader upon the Dark Father. He is wholeheartedly on the side of the dark forces. The demons who have set up a propaganda shop in the son's psyche convince him that his father's darkness is deeper than the son ever imagined. What can be done about that? The son finds out early that his mother cannot redeem his father. Moreover, in most cases, she doesn't want to. The only one left to do it is the son. As long as the political kings remained strong, the father picked up radiance from above, and the son tried to emulate the father, to become as bright as he is, to reach to his height. The son perceives the father as bright. Though this may not have been true in reality, we notice that literature as late as the 18th century is full of this sort of deference, this reverence for the father, and emulation. In our time, when the father shows up as an object of ridicule, as he does on television, or a fit field for suspicion, as he does in Star Wars, or a bad-tempered fool when he comes home from the office with no teaching, or a weak puddle of indecision, as he stops inheriting kingly radiance, the son has a problem. How does he imagine his own life as a man? Some men fall into a secret despair. They have probably adopted, by the time they are 6, their mother's view of their father, and by 20 will have accepted society's critical view of fathers, which amounts to a dismissal. What can they do but ask women for help? That request is not all bad, but even the best-intentioned women cannot give what is needed. Some father-hungry sons embody a secret despair they do not even mention to women. Without actually investigating their own personal father and why he is as he is, they fall into a fearful hopelessness, having fully accepted the generic diminished idea of father. Quotation, "I am the son of defective male material, and I'll probably be the same as he is." End of quotation. Then, with this secret, they give up, collapse, live with a numb place inside, feel compelled to be dark because the father's dark. They lose the vigorous participation in political battles, so characteristic of 19th century men in the United States, feel their opinions do not matter, become secret, underground people, and sometimes drown themselves in alcohol while living in a burrow under the earth. Other sons respond by leaping up and flying into the air. Many contemporary sons do not fight the father as in earlier eras, or figure out strategies to defeat him, but instead ascend above him, beyond him. We have transcendental psychology, the psychology of men like Thoreau, determined to have a higher consciousness than their fathers. Flying of that sort does not rescue the father either. The ascensionist son is flying away from the father, not toward him. A great theme in fairy stories is that there are two kings. Trouble happens with one's own father, the first king. Then one has to leave the castle. After some time of suffering and isolation, a second king somehow appears in the picture, finds the hero or heroine while hunting, adopts him or her, and sets a task. Then a complicated dance begins, as the adventurer tries to establish a fruitful connection with the new king. We remember that the boy in our story, having no craft, he shows some lack of father teaching in that detail, takes a job as a kitchen helper in a castle which is not his father's castle. Here he experiences soot and ashes, even though he still retains his golden hair. After some time in the kitchen, the cook gives him an order to take food to the king. The story says it this way. We are entering the story again. You know, on this planet, there are only night and day. In the place we're going to, there is a third state. Neither night nor day. Once when it happened that no one else was at hand, the cook ordered the boy to carry food to the royal table. But because the boy did not want his golden hair to be seen, he kept his turbouche on. Such a thing as that had never happened in the king's presence, and he said, "When you come to the royal table, you must take your cap off." The boy answered, "Oh, Lord, I cannot. I have a sore place on my head." The king called the cook up, scolded him, and demanded how he could have taken such a boy as that into his service, and told him to fire the boy and get him out of the castle. This gold hair helps us to survive in adolescence, but it's more an intrusion than a help. And the boy in our story says it quite accurately. I have a sore on my head. Such hair is a taste of heaven, but we don't know what to do with it when we meet the king, whether to let it show and brag about it, or hide it and be devious. Everyone wants to be with the king. We know how intensely young girls wanted to be in the presence of Elvis the king, or more recently to be near a prince. The Dalai Lama acts out the king for many people now, for some replacing even the Pope. The hunger for the father transmutes into the hunger for the king. But the story says that having golden hair doesn't give us leave to remain in his chambers. Perhaps each of us has taken some sort of kitchen job, got acquainted with the ashes, even endured a katabasis, but that doesn't mean we can have a long stay with the king. The guards let us in and escort us out again. That's what the story says. Visits to the king, even when we are young, do not last long. The alchemist would say that even though we have done good ashes work, the soul is still contaminated with infantile angers, unrealistic hopes, and rage at our parents or at ourselves. Another way to say that is that we know in the kitchen what we've learned from the senses. We know wood and fire and ashes, and that's it. Our soul, when it's in the kitchen, resembles some sort of crude or mixed rock. Spirit, being clarified and single, cannot make a clear impression on this crude stuff until later. The king, by contrast, who lives in his room high in the castle among air and sunlight, suggests solar power and the holy intellect. The king has arrived at unity. He is undistorted, unmingled, as compared to the boy of ashes or the sooty girl, and he looks on matters differently. We should not be surprised if the boy's visit in our story is short. If the visit to the king's room is so important and so emotionally charged, we should look in more detail at what the ancient world meant by the word king. King and queen have a long and honorable history in the invisible realm of myth and fairy stories, where the words do not imply human beings, let alone persons of gender, as well as a long history in the visible realm of monarchy, where they do. We'll distinguish among three kings: the upper, sacred king, the middle, political king, and the third, or inner king. There is a sacred king in the imaginative or invisible world. We don't know how he got there. Perhaps human beings, after having loved the political king for centuries, lifted him up into the invisible world, or perhaps it went the other way around. At any rate, there's a king in sacred space. From his mythological world, he acts as a magnet and rearranges human molecules. Whenever the word king or queen is spoken, something in the body trembles a little. The king and the queen send energy down. They resemble the sun and the moon that pierce down through the earth's atmosphere. Even on cloudy days, something of their radiant energy comes through. These magnets or whirlwinds do things, are verbs. They affect our feelings and actions the way a magnet arranges tiny flakes of iron. The flakes move into a pattern. So a human being finds his or her feelings arranged in a pattern when in a room with the king. John Weir Perry calls the sacred king the Lord of the Four Quarters. The Lord of the Four Quarters sits with his queen, who is the Queen of the Four Quarters. Neither king nor queen undermines the other's power. Both live in a mythological, eternal, and luminous realm, which we can call the mythological layer, or the eternal realm. I would estimate that people in the West lost their ability to think mythologically around the year 1000, and then the layer collapsed. Perhaps because Christianity would not allow any new stories or new gods, or perhaps because, after the Renaissance, the exciting pursuit of science absorbed more and more energy, the layer was never reconstituted. European men and women gradually stopped feeding the abundant gods and goddesses with their imaginative energy. The inner heaven collapsed, and we see all around our feet its broken glass. The gods are lying all around our feet. The king in our story, high in his chamber, represents this sacred and eternal king. He lacks a queen in our story, and we don't know if the storyteller lost the queen or if something is being said through the queen's absence. He does have a daughter, though, and she, with her great power, will become the queen later in this tale. By his presence in the story, the king indicates that the landscape around Iron John is an ordered space. It is a cosmos rather than a chaos. Earthly kings, as leaders of huge cities and empires, holding broad powers, are first noticed during the second millennium BC in the city-states of Mesopotamia. As principles of order, they began to fall in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. Under the title of Kaiser, Tsar, Emperor, Maharaja, Sultan, Bey, one after another, the kings fell, all through Europe and then throughout its colonies. During the Middle Ages, kings would take tours of their earthly realms. Hundreds of people waited in English village lanes, for example, to see the king go by. They probably felt a blessing coming from the sacred king, as the physical one passed silently by. The problem is that when the political king disappears from the lanes, even for good reason, we find it difficult to see or feel the eternal king. I am not saying that the king killing was an error, nor that we should resurrect the king and send him out along the lanes again, but we need to notice that our visual imagination becomes confused when we can no longer see the physical king. Wiping out kings severely damages the mythological imagination. Each person has to repair that imagination on his or her own. When the political or earthly kings lose respect, cannot do their work, lose their connection to the sacred king, become dilettantes or gods, are killed, vanish from our sight, then things change. The imagination has more to do. It doesn't do it. Our fathers then become lessened in our mind's eye. Now we also have inside us a third king, whom we can honor or not, and we'll call him the inner king. The inner king is the one in us who knows what we want to do for the rest of our lives, or the rest of the month, or the rest of the day. He can make clear what we want without being contaminated in his choice by the opinions of others around us. The inner king is connected with our fire of purpose and passion. When we were 1 or 2 years old, the inner king, we would guess, was alive and vigorous. We often knew then what we wanted, and we made that clear to ourselves and to others. For most of us, our king was killed early on. No king ever dies for good, but he falls over and dies. The process of bringing the inner king back to life, when looked at inwardly, begins with attention to tiny desires, catching hints of what one really likes. William Stafford describes that as taking in our fingers the end of the golden thread. We notice the turns of thought or language that please us. One remembers at 40 or 50 what sort of woman or man we really like. What were the delights we felt in childhood, before we gave our life over to pleasing other people, or being nurses to them, or doing what they wanted done? The diminishment of the father and the collapse of the outer king makes the longing for the inner king intense, almost unbearable. There is some connection with addiction in this intense longing for the inner king. I would say that after the attention to tiny desires, the next step in developing the inner king begins not with resolutions, but with a long grief over the dead inner king, surrounded by his dead warriors. And the inner king, once recovered, requires feeding and honoring if he is to remain alive. And each man or woman has to figure out how to do that for him or herself. Now, there's a double stream inside the sacred king that we should also discuss. The sacred king in his upper room comes towards us with a shining face. He blesses, he encourages creativity, he establishes by his presence alone an ordered universe. But there is, as Robert Moore, the psychologist and theologian, has said so cogently and vividly, a second, darker side of the king, who curses young men, discourages creativity, and establishes by his presence alone disorder. If these whirlwind or hurricane beings are a part of nature, then we can assure ourselves that day will be accompanied by night, that plants will produce poisonous as well as healing substances. The sacred king sends his radiance down through the atmosphere, and the poison king, which is our name for the dark side of the sacred king, sends his radiance down as well. That means that in the political world there will be a Herod as well as an Arthur. In Kafka's Metamorphoses, the son wakes one morning and finds he is somehow turned into a bug with a shell. We suspect the poison side of the Great Father is somewhere around. The insect son crawls under his own bed and lives there, exercising occasionally by crawling around on the living room walls while the father's absent. The father returns unexpectedly one day, and seeing the son insect up on the wall, throws an apple that dents the shell and damages the son's soft interior body. When the apple from the Garden of Eden hits the shell, we are out of psychological thinking and into mythological thinking. The father all at once carries something of a malignant Jehovah and a shamer on some fantastic, enormous level. The destructive father, or the poison father, does not give energy to those in his family, but draws it out of them into some black hole he shelters in himself. He draws that energy out steadily, as the great tyrants we know of draw it from their citizens. Because of the tremendous hunger we each feel for the king, the sacred or blessing king, we want to start living with him right now. We want to leap over our father and move to his place. But it appears we cannot move there until we have dealt with the axe-father. To the question, why can't we stay longer with the king? We have to answer, children visit the king, but adults make a place where the king can visit them. We inquire then about the living space we have in our head for our own father. What sort of rooms have we made up for him? If we have the grudging, stingy respect for him suggested by the sitcoms, the chances are the room will be in a rundown neighborhood with sagging door, plastic curtains, and a smelly refrigerator with rotten food in it, maybe small black dogs tied to the radiators. The son's first job, then, in a country like ours, is to redo that room, clean it, widen it, refurnish it, honor the father's clear and helpful side. The men who love their father simply and completely, and there are many of them, will find this work easy. Some men, of course, know consciously only the positive side of their father and don't have a clue about his dark side. Men with such an ideal father in their heads need to build an entire extra room for the father's twisted, secretive, destructive, vulgar, shadowy side, even if he was a hero to others. If we haven't made 2 rooms and furnished them, we can't expect our fathers, living or dead, to move in. Those men who have made both rooms inside their souls could begin to think of inviting a mentor in. He will also need 2 rooms. God also, it is said, is 2 sides, and God will surely never come to live with the person who hasn't made space in the soul for the king, for the mentor, and for his own father's blessed and poisoned sides. As we end this section on the king and the father with the image of an apartment that we need to make with 2 rooms in which we invite our own father, and then we invite the mentor, and then we invite the king, and then we might invite God, we recognize that we've hit on something hard here. In the United States, the sons and daughters feel there is too little father, and that is probably not going to get better. Fathers themselves have not changed so much. It's rather that they seem to us smaller, because we do not see behind them or through them the blessed king or the destructive king. The father seems opaque, the sacred king seems farther away, and our eyesight is not too good. When the mythological layer collapses and the political kings fall, then the patriarchy as a positive force is over. The sun and moon energies can no longer get down to earth. Ancient Celtic mythology has an image for the end of the patriarchy, and this is how their image goes. Eagles sit on the top branches of the sacred tree, with dead animals beneath their claws. Rotting bits of flesh fall down through the branches to the ground beneath. where the swine eat them. We are the swine. When all the meat that comes down from above is rotten, then neither the sons nor the daughters receive the true meat. What is coming down through television is rotten meat. Women have been and still are right in their complaints about the food they find on this earth. But men are not well fed either. And my objection doesn't imply that we need to build up the patriarchy again, but that we need to understand that we are starving. The more difficult it is to visit the king, the more hungry everyone is. The perceived absence of the father is actually the absence of the true king. Men and women have been separated from the king before. This separation has apparently happened many times in past centuries. It'll be interesting to go back to our story then and see what happens next after the boy fails to visit the king for any long period of time. Now, we've come a long way already in this story of Iron John. What is left then? We can't stop the story here because, for one thing, the feminine has not appeared. The boy's mother, as the maternal form of the feminine, has of course appeared, but that's all. And now he's about to meet the feminine in a non-maternal form, in its powerful, blossoming, savvy, wild, instigating, erotic, playful form. She is the savvy woman on the earth plane. On the mythological plane, we could call her the woman who loves gold, or as some fairy stories call her, the woman with golden hair. In ordinary daily life, a boy meets the maternal feminine at birth, before birth, in fact, and it's a solid meeting or not, depending on the mother and her ability to bond. A man has many meetings with the feminine in grade school and teenage years. We meet the erotic feminine many times before we have actually taken the Ashes road. Our story simply ignores these earlier meetings, for they, though sweet, are not it. For example, the relatively unconscious man at 24 years of age may have an affair with a relatively unconscious woman who is 24 and nothing happens at all. Usually both have less consciousness after the affair than they had before it. Our story is going to talk of a meeting with the savvy feminine that happens after the Ashes, and the narrative implies that a fruitful meeting of that sort takes place only after the man has left the cellar and has gone into what we're going to call the garden. So we'll look now at how the story says this. We are leaving our time once more. You know, on this planet there's fire, earth, air, water. We're going now to the place where the fifth element is. You'll remember that the king had called up the cook and scolded him and demanded how he could have taken such a boy as this into his service, told him to fire the boy and get him out of the castle. The cook, however, had pity on the youngster and exchanged him for the gardener's boy. Now, the boy had to set out plants in the garden, water them, chop with his hoe and spade, let wind and bad weather do what they wished. Now, once in summer, when he was working in the garden by himself, it got so hot that he pulled his little head covering off so that the breeze would cool his head. And when the sun touched his head, his hair glowed and blazed out so brightly that beams of sunlight went all the way up into the bedroom of the king's daughter. And she leapt up to see what that could be. She spied the boy outside, and she called to him, "Boy, bring me a bunch of flowers." Well, the boy quickly put his tarbouche back on. He picked some wildflowers for her, and he tied them in a bunch. And as he started up the stairs with them, the gardener met him and said, "What are you doing bringing the king's daughter these ordinary flowers? Get moving, pick another bouquet, the best we have, all those wonderful chrysanthemums." "No, no," the boy said. "The wildflowers have stronger fragrance, and they will please her more." Well, when the boy walked into her room, the king's daughter said, "Take your head thing off. It isn't proper for you to wear it in my presence." He replied, "I don't dare to do that. I have a mange, you know." She, however, grabbed the tarbouche and jerked it off. and his golden hair tumbled down around his shoulders, and it was magnificent to look at. He started out the door to run, but she held him by the arm and gave him a handful of gold coins. He took them and left, but he put no stock in them. In fact, he brought the coins to the gardener, and he said, "I'm giving these to your children. They can use them to play with." Well, the next day the king's daughter again called the boy to her and said she'd like to have some more wild flowers. When he walked in with them, she reached for his little hat, and she would have torn it away, but he held on to it with both hands. Once more she gave him a handful of gold coins. Once more he refused to keep them, and he gave them to the gardener as playthings for his children. Well, on the third day things went the same way. She couldn't manage to get his hat off, and he wouldn't accept the gold coins. We know we are in the presence of something elaborate here. When the storyteller has the sunlight hit the gold hair, then bounce to the wall of the princess's chamber, and from there into her eyes. This garden scene is witty, astonishing, playful, serious, delighting in leaps. Many a man can remember meeting a woman who turned out to be faithful for his life in some such playful way. A telephone number falls out of a wallet, or he goes to the wrong restaurant, or he and she both stumble over the curb at the wrong moment, or they both choose the same book at the library, noticing it at the checkout desk, or the dog's leashes get entangled, or they get assigned the same task at some benefit and fight over who should do it. All these experiences of coincidence, simultaneity, serendipity, synchronicity, light, suggest that something is about to happen that belongs to or is part of the other world. We conclude, then, that this woman has some connection with the other world. All this began when the cook in our story assigned the boy to garden work. And you know what you do with ashes is put them in the garden. The word garden in mythological tradition suggests a walled garden. Garden suggests a place marked out, separated from farmyard, grain field, field, or desert, in order that human beings can cultivate there precious plants or flowers. Entering the garden, we escape from the rain of blows offered by the world and find a temporary shelter. The walled garden is a place to develop introversion. The enclosed garden is also the right place for lovers. Trysting lovers in medieval literature, Tristan and Isolde, for example, have their dangerous meetings there. Initiation asks every man at a certain point to become a lover, that is, to develop the lover in him from seed to flower. And we know that in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, for example, and other Renaissance accounts, it was not at all unusual for a young man at that time to take 2 or 3 years off and spend it learning to be a lover. We spend those years in graduate school instead. But the man learning to be a lover would learn how to play a musical instrument because the resonance of the strings affect the heart. He would learn poems by heart. He would practice setting them to his own music and then sing them to introverted women sitting behind iron window bars. This is garden work with longing in it. For us, garden work may begin unexpectedly. An illness that confines a sufferer to a room for weeks may be his enclosed garden. An accident may bring it on. Thoreau, on the other hand, chose to live for some months in a cabin he built himself, and he and his cabin and Walden Pond were his garden. He knew very well that he had become a lover, and he said, "A match has been found for me at last. I have fallen in love with a shrub oak." Some men entering the garden begin by getting up at 5 a.m. and keeping an hour for themselves each morning before work. A father, in order to do that, may have to resist his own insistence that his life belongs to his work, his children, and his marriage. Making a garden and living in it means attention to boundaries, and sometimes we need the boundaries to prevent caretaking from coming in and occupying all our time. The boy in our story has met the king's daughter, attracted to him by his gold hair. So we have called her the woman who loves gold, and she belongs to the mythological world. What would it be like for an ordinary boy to meet the woman who loves gold? I remember a man telling me of a summer that he spent at 15 working as a busboy in a Catskills resort. He and the other boys were doing all right until one day a tall, blonde, beautiful, self-contained, high-cheekboned 16-year-old girl walked into the dining room. The whole thing was over in a moment. The 15-year-old boy sank under the waves, bubbles came up, he was lost. It's interesting that neither he nor his equally moved friends ever talked to her. Instead, they spent hours after work discussing who spoke to her today, what she wore at breakfast, whom she walked up with, who sat at her table. Her face and its beauty, which seemed inaccessible or invulnerable, made them all feel like hicks, inarticulate clods of earth, hopelessly matter-ridden louts. She was above matter. For 3 weeks the obsession went on. They woke up every morning feverish. Then the summer ended. She left, and that was it. There was only one event in the summer, that one. The 16-year-old girl was not the woman with golden hair, but the boys didn't know that. They saw what they saw. They saw the track of the moon on the water. They saw the king's daughter. They were deliciously confused. The girl on her side is equally confused. She may in reality be lacking in self-esteem, be insecure, shamed, even victimized. But on the outside, in the radiance from her face, she is queenly, self-possessed, golden, invulnerable. The gold woman in the other world sends her radiance down through the atmosphere, and the radiance appears on the girl's face. Now, if the boys had been 18, one of them might have spoken to her and courted her. He might even have made love to her, and in the course of all that, he would have realized that she wasn't she. What a disappointment. When she asks him why he has lost interest, he may even tell her of his disappointment. We're looking at a source of a lot of desperation in certain men here, and a lot of suffering in certain women. A man may repeat the courting and disappointment over and over. One man, about 35, told me that confusion about these layers had ruined his life. His life had gone like this. He sees a woman across the room, knows immediately that it's she. He drops the relationship he has, pursues her, feels wild excitement, passion, beating heart, obsession. After a few months, everything collapses. She becomes an ordinary woman. He is confused and puzzled. Then he sees once more a radiant face across the room, and the old certainty comes again. Her face seems to give out a whisper. All those who love the woman with golden hair come to me. She doesn't seem to realize she is sending out that whisper. Of course, the whisper gives her great power because men offer to rearrange their lives for her. But it isn't real power, and when men leave her, she feels insignificant and small, abandoned, powerless. A generation ago, millions of American men gave their longing for the gold-haired woman to Marilyn Monroe. She offered to take it, and she died from it. The glory of the sacred king drifts down to a public figure, a leader, and to a father who can receive it. The glory of the woman with golden hair drifts down from its eternal luminous space onto a public figure such as Marilyn Monroe or Meryl Streep, and then to a 16-year-old girl in a Catskills resort. Underneath the invulnerable face is an ordinary human girl, highly vulnerable, being pulled up and down by these impersonal, ruthless forces. If an ancient Greek saw a man who had Zeus energy, he would never say, that man is Zeus. His mythology distinguished the layers. Now that mythology has collapsed, contemporary men again and again confuse a living woman with the woman who has golden hair. A living woman with a stomach, small intestine, and a disturbed childhood is not the woman of light. What does it mean when a man falls in love with a radiant face across the room? It may mean that he has some soul work to do. His soul is the issue. Instead of pursuing the woman and trying to get her alone, away from her husband, he needs to go alone himself, perhaps to a mountain cabin for 3 months, write poetry, canoe down a river, and dream. That would save some women a lot of trouble. The writer and analyst John Layard says that when a man is ready to make a decisive move towards his own soul, a feminine figure whose face looks both ways will appear in his dreams. It is as if this dream figure has 2 faces. One looks toward the world of rule and laws, and the other toward the world of dragonish desire, moistness, wildness, adult manhood, legends. This dream figure is not a flesh and blood woman, but a luminous eternal figure. She is the woman with golden hair. The woman who looks two ways has appeared in our tale now. Iron John wants the young man to experience the garden. Once the garden, which may take 10 years to develop, has been experienced, then we could say that the young man has begun to honor his soul. He has learned to become a lover, and he has learned to dance. The story will move faster from now on. So let's return to the story. We are leaving our time now. We are going to the place where the oceans are disturbed, not only on the surface, but far down, where all the birds have enormous peacock tails. Not long after the gardener's boy had met the king's daughter, the whole country was swept up in war. The king gathered his forces and was not positive he could succeed against the enemy, who was powerful and retained a large army. The gardener's boy said, "Well, I'm quite grown now, and I'll go to war if you'll just give me a horse." But the other men laughed, and they said, "When we're gone, you go look in the stable. We'll certainly leave a horse behind for you." When they had all gone, the boy went into the barn and led a horse out. Well, it was lame in one leg, and it walked hippity-hoppity. He climbed on it, and he rode to the dark forest. When he came to its edge, he called 3 times, "Iron John, Iron John, Iron John," so loud it echoed through the trees. In a moment, the wild man arrived and said, "What is it that you want?" "I want a strong war horse because I intend to go to war." "You will receive that, and more than you have asked for as well." The wild man turned then and went back into the woods, and not long afterwards a stable boy came out of the trees leading a war horse that blew air through its nostrils and was not easy to hold in. Running along after the horse came a large band of warriors entirely clothed in iron, with their swords shining in the sun, and the boy turned his 3-legged nag over to the stable boy, mounted the new horse, and rode out at the head of the soldiers. By the time he neared the battlefield, a large part of the king's men had already been killed, and not much more was needed to bring them to total defeat. The boy and his iron band rode there at full speed, galloped on the enemy like a hurricane, struck down everyone who opposed them, and the enemy turned to flee, but the boy kept after them and pursued them to the last man. Then, however, instead of returning to the king, the boy took his band a roundabout way back to the forest and called Iron John out. "Iron John, Iron John, Iron John." "What is it that you want?" the wild man said. "You can take your horse and your men back and give me again my 3-legged nag." So it all happened as he requested, and he rode the hoppity-hop back home. When the king returned to his castle, his daughter went to him and congratulated him on his victory. "It wasn't me," he said, "who managed that, but a strange knight and his warrior band who arrived to help." The daughter asked who this strange knight was, but the king didn't know, and added, "He galloped off in pursuit of the enemy, and that's the last I saw of him." The girl applied to the gardener and said, "Where was your boy this afternoon?" He laughed and he said, "He's just now arrived home on his 3-legged nag. The farm help made fun of him, and they said, 'Guess who's here? Moopy Goop.' And then they said, 'You've been under a lilac bush, huh? How was it?' And the boy said back to them, 'I fought very well. If I hadn't been there, who knows what would have happened?' And they all fell over themselves laughing. So it's time now for the warrior. It's time in the development of a man for the warrior to come in. Michael Meade reminds us of the old Celtic motto, "Never give a sword to a man who can't dance." Our story says that the next step for the boy is warriorhood, after the garden, not before it. The warriors inside American men have become weak in recent years, and their weakness contributes to a lack of boundaries, a condition which earlier we spoke of as naivete. A grown man 6 foot tall will allow another person to cross his boundaries, enter his psychic house, verbally abuse him, carry away his treasures, and then slam the door behind. and the invaded man will stand there with an ingratiating, confused smile on his face. When a boy grows up in a dysfunctional family, perhaps there is no other kind of family, his interior warriors will be killed off early. Warriors mythologically lift their swords to defend the king. The king in a child stands up for and stands for the child's mood. But when we are children, our mood gets easily overrun and swept over in the messed up family by the more powerful, more dominant, more terrifying mood of the parent. We can say that when the warriors inside cannot protect our mood at 3 years old from being disintegrated or defend our body from invasion, the warriors collapse, go into a trance, or die. Each child lives deep inside his or her own psychic house, or soul castle, and the child deserves the right of sovereignty inside that house. Whenever a parent ignores the child's sovereignty and invades, the child feels not only anger but shame. The child concludes that if it has no sovereignty, it must be worthless. Shame is the name that we give to the sense that we are unworthy and inadequate as human beings. When our parents do not respect our territory at all, their disrespect seems overwhelming proof of our inadequacy. A slap across the face pierces deeply, for the face is the actual boundary of our souls, and we have been penetrated. If a grown-up decides to cross our sexual boundaries and touch us, there's nothing that we as children can do about it. Our warriors die. The child, so full of expectation or blessing, whenever he or she is around an adult, stiffens with shock and falls into the timeless, fossilized confusion of shame. What is worse, one sexual invasion or one beating usually leads to another, and the warriors, if revived, die again. I think it's likely that the early death of a man's warriors keeps the boy in him from growing up. It's possible that it also prevents the female in the boy from developing. We know that Dickens, for example, endured a horrendous childhood, and we also notice that his female characters tend to be sentimental and girlish. It's possible that these girlish beings are projections of his stunted interior woman, whom his warriors could not protect from the violence all around him. The inner boy in a messed-up family may keep on being shamed, invaded, disappointed, and paralyzed for years and years. I am a victim, he says, over and over, and he is. But that very identification with victimhood keeps the soul house open and available for still more invasions. Most American men today do not have enough awakened or living warriors inside to defend their soul houses. Women cannot defend their soul houses either. Most people do not know what genuine outward or inward warriors would look like or feel like. Psychologist and theologian Robert Moore has thought cogently and intensely about the warrior, and we'll sum up a few of his ideas about the outward or disciplined warrior. He emphasizes that for men, the energy of the warrior is hardwired. It is not software. He may say to men, "You have plenty of warrior in you. Don't worry about it. More than you'll need. The question is whether you will honor it, whether you will have it consciously or unconsciously." The warrior's area of expertise and experience is the battlefield. The war that takes place there can be physical war, psychological war, or spiritual war. Inside that reverberating and ritual space, armies, tribes, divinities, even ideas arrange themselves in adversarial fashion. Flags go up, voices deepen, brains sharpen, urgency tightens muscles. Extroverted men in the warrior mode, like General Patton, imagine battle, steel on steel, the holiness of the battlefield, as holy to them as the black-seeded field is to the farmer. They imagine that rushing in of adrenaline, personal combat, the delight of danger, even the joy of noble death. Moore emphasizes that the quality of a true warrior is that he's in service to a purpose greater than himself, that is, to a transcendental cause. Mythologically, he's in service to a true king. If the king he serves is corrupt, as in Ollie North's case, or if there's no king at all, and he is serving greed or power, then he's no longer a warrior, but a soldier. When a warrior is in service, however, to a true king, that is, to a transcendent cause, he does well, and his body becomes a hard-working servant, which he requires to endure cold, heat, pain, wounds, scarring, hunger, lack of sleep, hardship of all kinds. The person in touch with warrior energy can work long hours, ignore fatigue, do what is necessary, finish the PhD and all the footnotes, endure obnoxious department heads, live sparsely like Ralph Nader, write as T.S. Eliot did under a single dangling light bulb for years, clean up shit and filth endlessly like St. Francis or Mother Teresa, endure contempt, disdain, and exile as Sakharov did. We need to mention as well the sacred or holy warrior who lives in eternal space. The field for him, for the holy warrior, is the field of good and evil. Ancient literature, such as the Ramayana or Mahabharata, carries many more descriptions of these impalpable, invisible battles than of the battlefields in which human beings live and die. How can any complicated culture live without strong warrior energy? The outward warriors inside some women are today strong, sometimes stronger than those in men. Forces in contemporary society recently have encouraged women to be warriors while discouraging warriorhood in boys and men. We could say that the sacred warrior disappeared in our culture and the personal warrior as well. At Ypres in 1915, 100,000 young men died in one day, all of whom died without seeing the machine gunners who killed them. Anything left of the warrior vanished with the mass bombings of Dresden, the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the B-52 bombings of rice fields in Vietnam. Contemporary war, with its mechanical and heartless destruction, has made the heat of aggression seem disgraceful. The Vietnam veterans suffered soul damage in that they went into battle imagining they served a warrior god and came back out of it godless. We can all add further details of the decline from warrior to soldier to murderer, but it's important to notice the result. The disciplined warrior, made irrelevant by mechanized war, disdained and abandoned by the high-tech culture, is fading in American men. And the fading of the warrior contributes to the collapse of civilized society. A man who cannot defend his own space cannot defend women or children. The poisoned warriors, called drug lords, prey primarily for recruits on kingless, warriorless boys. If a culture does not deal with the warrior energy, take it in consciously, discipline it, honor it, it will turn up outside in the form of street gangs, wife-beating, brutality to children, and aimless murder. And it all moves so swiftly. The massive butcheries of 1915 finish off the disciplined or outward warrior, and then within 30 years, the warriors inside Western men begin to weaken. The double weakening makes us realize how connected the outer and the inner world are, how serious the events of history are. Warriorhood is associated with the god Mars, and Mars with iron. Men now experience a shortage of iron. Men now do not know how to retrieve and revive their inner warriors. Oftentimes, that goes back to early childhood. A boy at 5, for example, may put one hand on his mother's heart and the other on the earth and conduct her pain down to the ground. Or he may conduct his father's rage to the ground. Many of us lived as copper conductors of intense emotions of our parents. We lived as copper conductors, not as boys. Such a man will then look, when adult, for a woman whose pain he can continue to conduct to the earth. So we can say that men now have too much copper and not enough iron. This is another way to refer to the shortage of the interior warrior. So it was Iron John's purpose in the last warrior section to help the boy develop more iron. It's the job of the older men to do the work of initiation. We know that our society produces a plentiful supply of boys, but seems to produce fewer and fewer men. Some contemporary cultures, the New Guinea tribes would be examples, who are warrior cultures, force the boys to be men through various cunning, heated, imaginative, reckless austerities and teachings that may happen too quickly to produce a solid man. We come in at the opposite end of the spectrum in that we have no ideas at all on how to produce men, and we let it all happen unconsciously. while we look away to Wall Street and hope for the best. Michael Ventura, in a magnificent essay called The Age of Endarkenment, published recently in the Whole Earth Review, speaks of adolescent wildness and its challenge to our lack of ideas. Their music, their fashions, their words, their codes, he says, announce that the initiatory moment has come. Those extravagances are a request for a response. Ventura remarks, "Tribal people everywhere greeted the onset of puberty, especially in males, with elaborate and excruciating initiations, a practice that plainly wouldn't have been necessary unless their young men were as extreme as ours. The tribal adults didn't run from this moment in their children as we do. They celebrated it. They would assault their adolescents with quite literally holy terror, rituals that had been kept secret from the young until that moment, rituals that focused upon the young, all the light and darkness of their tribe's collective psyche, all its sense of mystery, all its questions, and all the stories told to both harbor and answer those questions. The crucial word here is focus. The adult had something to teach. Stories, skills, magic, dances, visions, rituals. In fact, if these things were not learned well and completely, the tribe could not survive. Tribal culture satisfied the craving while supplying the need, and we call that initiation. This practice was so effective that usually by the age of 15, a tribal youth was able to take his or her place as a fully responsible adult. Ventura notices that for about 40 years, the young in our culture have generated forms, music, fashions, behaviors, quote, that prolong the initiatory moment, as though hoping to be somehow initiated by chance somewhere along the way, unquote. It doesn't happen. Mick Jagger gets middle-aged and still the adults offer no response to the opening. There are many sorts of initiation, many models and many sequences of rituals and teachings. We have to recognize that all sequences of initiatory stages are linear, that we know of, and initiation itself resembles a sphere. So, with that warning, we could look now at a linear view of male initiation, which I'll lay out in 5 stages. The first stage would be bonding with the mother and separation from the mother. We do the first stage moderately well, and the second not well at all, particularly in the suburbs and the ghettos. Second stage, bonding with the father and separation from the father. We often postpone the father bonding until we're 50 or so, and then separation still has to be done. Third, the arrival of the male mother or the mentor, the man who helps a man rebuild the bridge to his own greatness or essence. King Arthur is an example of such a male mother. With us, this step happens haphazardly, if at all. And fourth, apprenticeship to some hurricane energy, such as the wild man or the warrior or Dionysius. When the young man has done that apprenticeship well, he receives a drink from the waters of the god. Such a drink is one thing the adolescents are asking for. And the 5th stage of initiation that we'll mention then is marriage with the holy woman or with the queen. The events of our story fit roughly into this model of classic initiation. Iron John represents the adult mentor who reconnects the boy to his greatness in the spring section and to his gold head. Iron John, as the wild man, is also himself the divine energy from whose waters the boy is allowed to drink. The lack of initiation in contemporary culture means that the boy receives no help in his very first task of initiation, namely separation from the mother. Our culture has paid attention in recent years, and rightly so, to men's physical incest with their daughters, which is hideous and revolting in its range and damage. And we have paid some attention to psychic incest as well between father and daughter. But the culture still does not take very seriously the damage caused by psychic incest between mother and son. 20 to 30% of boys now live in houses with no adult man present. But psychic incest is by no means restricted to single-parent homes. The emphasis placed in recent decades on the inadequacy of men and on the evil of the patriarchal system encourages mothers to discount grown men. Contemporary women have also become aware of their own rich interior lives. A 20th century woman feels complicated sensibilities in herself that no ordinary or mortal man can meet. I am suggesting then that 2 contemporary trends have come together. One is the increasing emphasis in the American culture on the adult man's inadequacy, even his absurdity, and the second is the woman's increased awareness of her own interior emotional richness. When these two trends come together, hope for change and fulfillment falls on young sons. The mother looks to the son for emotional satisfaction, and her fantasies in that regard may have deepened in recent years. It's not uncommon for grown men to turn to young women for sexual companionship. A grown woman may turn to her 8-year-old son for soul companionship. Her fantasies could include dreams that he'll redeem the crudities of other men, that he'll develop a mind open to women's values, and that she will have a soul companion in him. Perhaps, in her fantasies, he will live out some heroic scenario that she could not. Above all, she hopes that he may learn to be kind to women, kinder than his father was, and will be able to satisfy his own woman sexually. In short, she will hope that he'll become a better lover to his woman than his father was or is. Who could his woman be? Not all men move through the stages of initiation with the speed that Iron John's student does, who achieved a clean break with both mother and father early on. He has separated from the mother, separated from the father, received a mentor or a male mother, and he has experienced apprenticeship to a hurricane energy, which is here called the wild man. In what way has he received a drink from the waters of the God? Most of us receive enough shame by the time we are 20 so that our body horse is 3-legged. It has one shamed leg. Iron John lets him feel what it would be like to have a body without shame, a 4-legged horse. The young man we are watching, who is much luckier than most of us, has passed through the ashes and the garden and the battle. He rode to the battlefield on a whole horse lent to him by the wild man. He has returned his whole horse to the forest and ridden home on his hobbledehoy to the jeers of the stable boys, but he knows what he has accomplished. Why not end the story here? Men receive the warrior gift, that high ecstasy of service, from impersonal warrior mansions high in the genetic heavens. But there are things that life requires of us besides warriorhood. The warrior mode, moreover, has a poisoned or negative side. The warrior's twisted or poisoned side amounts to brutality, pillage, insistence on unconditional surrender, mindless killing, wife-beating, rape, betrayal of all the king's human values. Men invigorated by warrior energy need the ability to modulate out of the warrior mode. We know that we can't end the story here because the release from aggression or the passage through it has not yet appeared. Returning to the story, we remember that the last section ended with the victory over the king's enemies. We guess that the king's daughter has become curious about the identity of that mysterious knight who saved the kingdom. We remember that she suspects that the gardener's boy is someone unusual. It occurs to her that the only way to find out if the gardener's boy is the mysterious knight is to invite all the knights in the neighborhood to come to the court for a festival, and so to show themselves. This section of the story is called the Festival of Golden Apples. We are leaving our time now. You know, in this world, people feed from flesh or fish or fowl or vegetables. But in the place to which we are going, there's another food, which is none of those. So the king said to his daughter, "All right, I'll arrange a great festival that'll last 3 days, and you'll be the one who throws out the golden apple. Perhaps the mysterious knight will appear." After the announcement of the festival had been made, the young man rode to the forest's edge and called for Iron John. "Iron John, Iron John, Iron John!" "What do you need?" he said. "I want to catch the golden apple the king's daughter is going to throw." "There's no problem. You virtually have it in your hands right now," Iron John replied. "I'll provide you more. Red armor for the occasion and a powerful chestnut horse." The young man galloped to the field at the proper time on his chestnut horse, rode in among the other knights, and no one recognized him. The king's daughter stepped forward. She threw the golden apple right into the group of men. He was the one who caught it. Moreover, having caught it, he galloped off and was gone. When the second day arrived, Iron John had him fitted out with white armor and provided him with a white horse. This time also the apple fell into his hands. Once more, he did not pause for even an instant, but galloped off. That made the king angry. And the king said, "This behavior is not allowed. He is supposed to ride over to me and report his name. If he catches the apple the third time and he gallops off again," he said to his men, "chase him. What's more, if he refuses to return, give him a blow. Use your sword." Now for the third day of the festival, Iron John gave the young man a black horse with black armor, black bridle. That afternoon, the young man caught the apple again, but this time, when he rode away with it, the king's men galloped after him, and one got close enough to give him a leg wound with the end of his sword. The young man escaped, but his horse made such a powerful leap to do that the young man's helmet fell off, and everyone could see that he had golden hair. And the king's men rode home and told the king everything that had happened. Three themes or details in this passage seem to demand attention: the meaning of the golden apples, the curious nature of this festival, and the sequence of three colors insisted on for the horses. The golden apples in this story, as in many other stories, hint that the events are happening in some special space or time, that they are connected with ritual. The apple associates with immortality, and we know that some young men, when about to be sacrificed in the Greek ritual of Adonis, were given a golden apple as a passport to paradise. The word paradise means walled space in ancient Persian, and the Celts imagined paradise to be an apple orchard in the west where death is. This correlates with all sorts of details in old European life. For example, it is the apple that is bobbed for at Halloween, when the dead return to this world. Ritual banquets used to begin with the egg of the east and end with the apple of the west. It is natural that our story would now pass into ritual space. We notice that the knights do not fight during this festival. The fighting took place in the last section. The festival the king calls for does not involve javelins knocking men out of saddles, armor being pierced, sword blows that invade the intestines, or take off an arm at the shoulder. Some change is being asked for in the expression of warrior energy. We could say here that the young man learns to modulate out of aggression through display, form, and ritual. The young men display their beauty as they pass in process, and luck determines who gets the apple. Victor Turner, the anthropologist, has recovered in recent decades an almost forgotten concept of ritual space. Each person's interior emptiness, one could say, has its own shape. In ordinary life, we try to satisfy our longings and fill the emptiness. But in ritual space, both men and women learn to experience the emptiness or the longing and not to fill it. A man, for example, could be in the presence of innocence without moving to have sexual intercourse with it. Enjoy his fierceness without acting it out physically. Know his mother's neediness without moving to satisfy it. A warrior can enjoy the beauty of his sacred warriorhood without engaging in battle. In our story, during the festival, each knight joins the other knights in a parade or display where there is no violence. Having moved into ritual space, he slows down his speed, gives grace to his movements, offers a bow to the king and queen, pushes through no boundaries, offers no hostility, is there to be seen. We could say that this graceful display moves the princess to throw the apple at precisely the right moment. Biologists once thought that herons and geese created their puzzling ritual dances for fertility or survival reasons, that they were, in the word we use about ourselves, practical. But biologists in recent years, after extensive observation of herons, deer, geese, peacocks, and so on, have concluded that some ritual dances have no particular value for survival. They amount to display. Ritual space carries the young man out of machismo, out of battle, out of dominator fantasies. Blake called the highest stage of consciousness constant creativity, or the shining city of art. The golden apple lets one into the paradise of form. The knights in the festival participate in display as an expression of the love of form and beauty. It is closer to art than strutting. They are being led by ritual space away from war and toward community. Vietnam veterans would be in better shape today if we had arranged a festival in every small town of the country in which the veterans had ridden by and a young woman had thrown them golden apples. That parade would have honored their return to domestic life and included them in ceremonies of the golden apples, thousands of years old. The Vietnam-era commanders had no ritual to help the veterans when they arrived home. The Army flew them to New York and dumped them in the street. We all know what happened. More Vietnam men have now committed suicide since the war than died during it. The Black Wall in Washington is an attempt to remedy that failure. It's also a testimony to the Army's lack of imagination and to our reckless forgetting of all that men in the past knew about this supremely important change from warrior to non-warrior. We need to look next at the red, the white, and the black horses. The story says clearly that Iron John gave the young man a different colored horse, saddle, and armor on each of the 3 successive days, and we sense that some sort of information is being offered in that detail. All we can do is investigate the 3 colors and their associations and see what happens. We recall that the Queen in Snow White was sewing one day near an ebony window frame as the snow fell outside, and when she pricked her finger, 3 drops of blood fell on the snow. She said, "I want a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as this window frame." The fairy tale hero or heroine, whether in Russian, German, or Finnish tales, who chances to see a drop of red blood fall from a black raven into the white snow, sinks immediately into a yogic trance. That suggests the vast power that red, black, and white have or have had over human consciousness up through the Middle Ages. European fairy tales, when we examine them, insist on these 3 colors, and in Europe these 3 colors appear in a certain order. The best-known order or sequence of these colors is that mentioned in Snow White: white, red, black. We can call this order the Great Mother sequence. White, red, black names the 3 phases of the moon. First, the white of the Virgin and the new moon, then the red of motherhood and the full moon, and finally the black of the crone as the old moon. We each follow this path from innocence to fatherhood and motherhood, and finally to death. Our story remembers another road. If the Great Mother sequence lays out the feminine mysteries of life and death, then we could say that Iron John's sequence lays out the masculine mysteries of wounding and growth. This road begins with red. It goes red, white, black. If the young woman begins with the white of innocence or the white dress of confirmation, then the boy begins with red. The old initiators among the Gisu and Maasai in Africa lead the young Moran men, as they call them, immediately into the red. There the young men are encouraged to flare up, fight, see red, get into trouble. And in emotions, they are encouraged to express pride, to be arrogant, antisocial, quarrelsome, and be friends with anger. And the girls encourage them to fight. When a young man is red, he shows his anger. He shouts at people. He flares up like a match with a sulfur tip. He flushes red with anger. He fights for what is his, stops being passive, walks on the balls of his feet, is a red hawk, is fierce. Of course, no one trusts a red man very far. We try in our culture to overlook and leap over this red stage completely. We try these days to move young men by compulsory education directly from childhood into the white night. And we could say that sometimes a mother wants her son to be white when he's already in red. Conversely, a man in midlife may want his wife to be white and respectable when she has already moved into red. We know that the wild man in our story gives the young man a red horse on the first day. On the second day, he gives a white horse. What shall we say about white? A white knight is gleaming and shining. We usually make fun of that. But a white knight is also engaged. He fights for the good. He's no longer randomly antisocial. Ralph Nader is a white knight. He engages the corporate world. The danger with the white knight stage in our culture is that he is often insufferable because he has not lived through the red. White knights in our culture support the Cold War, and project bad redness onto the American Indians, or the red communists, or wild women, or black men. If a man hasn't lived through the red stage, he is a stuck white knight who will characteristically set up a false war with some concretized dragon, such as poverty or drugs or Saddam Hussein. The Bush-Dukakis debate was the sad debate of two stuck white knights. Such debates are remarkably boring. Now, on the third day, Iron John gives the young man in our story a black horse, with black saddle, black bridle, black armor. He is riding the black horse when he makes his decisive descent into woundedness and is wounded by the king's men. We can see increasing darkness at the edges of Rembrandt's paintings as he gets older. If you place in order Lincoln's photographs during his last 4 years, you can see him go into the black. People who are in the black usually give up blaming others. A mother once got into the White House and woke Lincoln up at 5 in the morning, saying that her son had been sent by train to Washington a few days before, had had no sleep, had been assigned to guard duty on arriving, had fallen asleep, and now was going to be shot at 8 that morning. If Lincoln had been in the red, he might have shouted for the guards, "Who let this woman in here? Get her out of here." If he were in the white, he might have said, "Madam, we all have to obey rules. Your son didn't obey the rules, and I feel as bad about it as you do, but I can't intervene." He didn't say any of these things. He said, "Well, I guess shooting him wouldn't help him much." And he signed a piece of paper. We notice that humor comes in with the black. If we take nothing else away from the Iron John story, we could usefully take this idea that the young male moves from red intensity to white engagement to black humanity. Each man is given 3 horses that he rides at different times of his life. We fall off and we get back on. I don't think we should consider one horse better than another. All we can say is that none should be skipped. We need 3 skills, for each horse has its own sort of gait. Each horse shies at different things, responds to a rider differently. Something has been left over from the story of the festival with the golden apples, and that is the wound to his leg the young man has just received. The new wound acts to concentrate the young man's attention on his thigh. As our story has proceeded, the young man has become more and more in touch with underworld treasures, its ashes, its armed men, its horses, and now the young man is sent, so to speak, to the lower half of his own body. A wounded leg affects locomotion. It's as if the boy's first wound to his finger sped him up, and this one slows him down, way down. The old tradition says that feeling is associated with slowness. Perhaps this wound deepens his feeling. Some old traditions say that no man is adult until he's become open to the soul in the spirit world, and they say that such an opening is done by a wound, in the right place, at the right time, in the right company. A wound allows the spirit or soul to enter. People too healthy, too determined to jog, too muscular, may use their health to prevent the soul from entering. They leave no door. Through the perfection of victory, they achieve health, but the soul enters through the hole of defeat. It is likely that in Iron John we are dealing with an initiatory wound, perhaps a wound given physically by old men initiators at some time in the past. We can speculate that the mentors gave a young man a thigh wound at some late stage of initiation. Apparently, the leg wound, when accomplished ritually or done in ritual space, strengthened young men. In mythology, we remember that Dionysius was born from Zeus's thigh. Because Dionysius' destiny was to be a man with 2 mothers, Zeus's thunderbolt ended his stay in Semele's womb. One story says that Hermes saved the unborn boy and sewed him up inside Zeus's thigh. Another story says that Zeus himself made the opening in his own thigh in order to provide a womb for Dionysius. This sort of thinking is thousands and thousands of years old. André Leroy Gourhan, who spent years studying the enigmatic Dordogne cave paintings, concluded that the famous scene of the wounded mammoth, the shaman in trance, and the bird-headed wand amounts to a study of the wound. We know from Siberian sources that the shaman must needs be a wounded man, and the spear gave Christ a wound in his side before his death. The old tradition says that women have two hearts, one heart in their chest and another heart in their womb. They are double-hearted. The old initiators then ritually make the young man, through the wound given in ritual space, double-hearted by giving him a womb in the thigh. Now the man has the physical heart he has always had, but he also has a compassionate heart. After having received the wound, then, the young man is ready to become a king, that is, to sit down with a queen. And we'll see how the story says that. It's time for the story once more. We're leaving our time now. And we're going to a place where grapes do not only produce wine, but they produce a drink that we don't know, that only those in that world know. The king's daughter the next day inquired to the gardener about his boy. "Oh, he's back at work in the garden. That strange coot, went to the festival yesterday, and he only got back last night. He showed my children, by the way, 3 golden apples that he had won." Well, the king called the young man in, and he appeared with his tarbouche back on his head. The king's daughter, however, went up to him and pulled it off, and his golden hair fell down over his shoulders. His beauty was so great that everyone was astounded. The king said, "Are you the knight who appeared each day at the festival with a different-colored horse and each day caught the golden apple?" "I am," he said, "and the apples are here." Taking the apples from his pocket, he handed them to the king. "If you need more evidence, you can look at the wound that your men gave me when they were chasing me. What's more, I am the knight who helped defeat the enemy." The king said, "If you can perform feats of that magnitude, you are obviously not a gardener's boy. Who is your father, may I ask?" "My father's a notable king, and I have a great deal of gold, as much as I will ever need." "It's clear," the king said, "that I am in debt to you. Whatever I have in my power that would please you, I will give." "Well," the young man said, "I suggest that you give me your daughter as my wife." Then the king's daughter laughed, and she said, "I like the way he doesn't beat about the bush. I already knew he was no gardener's boy from his golden hair." And she walked over and she kissed him. The young man's walk on an exclusively masculine path is now ended. The wild man, who is the god of nature, has guided the young man's initiation. Iron John's teaching never aimed at masculine separation or separatism anyway, and we will soon see how deeply and in how many different ways the progress of our story involves partnership with the feminine principle. In nature, the yang and the yin interweave everywhere. Nature is inconceivable without the incessant and joyful intermingling of receptivity and initiative, curiously mingled in all snail shells and oak trees, all tigers, all mountains, all bees. Time moves more swiftly in a fairy tale than with us, or more slowly, and the man in Earth time would be about 50 years old now, or older. Some flower has finally unfolded and blossomed. The young man has received through his descent a grounding that allows him to reconnect with some creativity that would have frightened him when he was younger. Most psychological systems don't want any expression of masculine grandeur. All talk of grandeur is called inflation. Our story carries from its outset a different view. It holds that human self-esteem is a delicate matter, and not to be dismissed as infantile grandiosity. Our, in quotation marks, mirrored greatness, end of quotation marks, as Heinz Kohut calls it, needs to be carefully honored, neither inflated nor crushed. If a man or a woman's mirrored greatness is entirely dismissed, he or she will become crippled and a candidate for all sorts of invasions by the group mind. The Indian poet Kabir says, referring to the body, "Inside this clay jug there are canyons and pine mountains, and the maker of canyons and pine mountains. All 7 oceans are inside, and hundreds of millions of stars." The young man in our story has become a friend of the wild man, and has received a drink of that luminous water. He has not lost his connection to the king. and the warrior has offered him a cup as well. All of this rebuilding of the bridge, all of this honoring of the great self, all of this distribution of those true waters that satisfy thirst has been in our story under the guidance of the wild man. So perhaps it's time now to ask, who is this wild man? Western man's connection with the wild man has been disturbed or interrupted for centuries now, and a lot of fear has built up. Every angel is dangerous, Rilke says. So, some fear is appropriate, but knowing nothing is not appropriate. Rather than looking outside for a wild man, we could look at the traces that remain inside us. One trace of the wild man is the spontaneity we have preserved from childhood. When the wild man has been preserved inside, a man also feels a genuine friendliness toward the wildness in nature. Thoreau said, "In literature, it is only the wild that attracts us." I think we are remembering the wild man now, and women are remembering the wild woman and other invigorators, because men and women need now, more than ever in history, to protect the earth, its creatures, the waters, the air, the mountains, the trees, the wilderness. Moreover, when we develop the inner wild man, he keeps track of the wild animals inside us and warns us when they are liable to become extinct. The wild man, we could also say, represents the positive side of male sexuality. The hair that covers his whole body is natural, like a deer's or a mammoth's. He has not been clean-shaven out of shame, and his instincts have not been so suppressed as to produce the rage that humiliates women. The wild man's sexuality does not feed on the feminine or on pictures of the feminine. It resonates also to hills, clouds, and ocean. The Native American has much wild man in him, and it comes out in love of ordinary things. The wild man also encourages a trust in what is below. The wild man encourages a trust of the lower half of our body, our genitals, our legs and ankles, our inadequacies, the souls, as we call them, of our feet, the animal ancestors, the earth itself, the treasures in the earth, the dead long buried there, the stubborn richness to which we descend. And finally, the wild man's energy is that energy which is conscious of a wound. His face, which we can see in medieval carvings, and his body, which we can see in a small basalt statue from about 4000 BC, contains grief, knows grief, shares grief with nature. The hard survivor in us has survived to adulthood, and each of us is a survivor. But the wild man leads the return we eventually have to make as adults to the place of childhood abuse and abandonment. The wild man is a better guide, in some ways, to that pain than our inner child is, precisely because he is not a child. Because he is not a child, he knows stories and can lead us into the personal suffering and through it. We must note that the aim is not to be the wild man, but to be in touch with the wild man. No sane man in Greece would say, as I've mentioned, "I want to be Zeus." But in American culture, past and present, we find people who want to be the wild man. Writers as intelligent as Kerouac failed to make a distinction between being the wild man and being in touch with. Trying to be the wild man ends in early death and confusion for everyone. We are ready now to turn to the last scene of the story, in which the masculine and the feminine, the heaven and the earth, the king and the queen come together at last. We notice that the original mother and father are also present. We are looking at a wedding ceremony interrupted by a strange event. This is the last scene in the story. We are leaving our time now. We want to repeat that we honor east, west, north, south. And we also honor the fifth direction, the vertical one that is in us here today. So the wedding feast was about to take place, and the young man's mother and father were among those invited to the wedding, and they came. They were in great joy because they had given up hope that they'd ever see their dear son again. While all the guests were sitting at the table for the marriage feast, the music broke off all at once. The great doors swung open, and a baronial king entered, accompanied in procession by many attendants. He walked up to the young groom, and he embraced him, and the guest said, "I am Iron John, who through enchantment turned into a wild man. You have freed me from that enchantment, and all the treasure that I own will from now on belong to you." As we look back at the story, we realize that the wild man has been slowly ascending step by step in harmony with the young man's slow descent. We have become used to seeing the wild man as wet, moist, foresty, ignorant, leafy, and all at once he is related to holy intellect and sun radiance. He is a king. The energy that is hidden by water, dark, lying on its back among reeds in the opening scene, becomes a luminous power here. As we watch, the great doors of the wedding hall open, and a baronial king enters with many well-dressed attendants. And when we hear or read this last scene, we say in some shock, whose story was this? We assumed it was the boy's story, but we see that it may be the wild man's story. And there is something we were ignorant of, some invisible force that we knew nothing about, has put the sophisticated energy of this being into a primitive form and shape, as if into a cage. Our work, then, as men and women, is not only to free ourselves from family cages and collective mindsets, but to release transcendent beings from imprisonment in trance. And that's a surprise. That's what the story says in the end. Our obligation, and I include in our, all the women and men writing about gender, is to describe masculine in such a way that it does not exclude the masculine in women, and yet hits a resonant string in the man's heart. No one says there aren't resonating strings in a woman's heart too, but in the man's heart there's a low string that makes his whole chest tremble when the qualities of the masculine are spoken of in the right way. Our obligation is to describe the feminine in a way that does not exclude the feminine in men, but makes a large string resonate in the woman's heart. Some string in the man's heart will resonate as well, but I suspect that in the woman's heart there is a low string that makes her whole chest tremble when the qualities of the feminine are spoken of in the right way. At the same time, we all know that there are in reality, besides these two states, feminine and masculine, all sorts of degrees, intermediate states, unions, combinations, special cases, genius, exceptions, and so on. For the time being, it is the men and women who are passed through the grief door into their own childhood, to whom the story we've retold will speak best. They will be able to use the story, and others like it, blessedly preserved by the memory culture that our ancestors lived in up until the time of writing. The young man in our story descended from courtyard to ashes, from ashes to earth, then to horses under the earth, and so on. The wild man passes him on the way up, having ascended from under the water to the courtyard, then to his own sacred spring, then to the master of horses, and finally to the state of kingship. The wild man part of each man, that was once in touch with wilderness and wild animals, has sunk today down below the water of the mind, out of sight, below human memory. Covered with hair now, it looks as if it were an animal itself. The wild man in our wedding scene says, in effect, a strong power forced me by enchantment to live under the water until a young man appeared who was ready to undergo the discipline and go through the suffering that you have gone through. And now that you have done that, I can appear as I am, a lord.